handy. I also have a personal thanks for this man because he came into my life at a time that allowed me to be standing here today because he housed my father, my brother, my sister, and myself for a period of life so that when we were homeless, my dad could get it together and take care of his children. So, San Francisco legendary alto saxophonist, educator, and kind-hearted, beautiful man with so many years of wisdom. Please welcome John Handy to the stage.
Good afternoon. I wear glasses, but not because I'm hip, but I'm hip without them too, because I do have the lights kind of bother me, and because I now live in the East Bay in Oakland, and I left my glasses at home and I couldn't read the notes anyhow, so I'm going to improvise as I do in the art of the music that I've played for over 64 years. I'm going to let me talk a little bit about the gentleman that I will introduce to you. We became acquainted around 1963 when he was president of CORE, and I was one of the vice presidents, and I know another vice president, Norman Brown, is out front. And his legacy is he was developing that then, and before that I got to know so much about him since just recently I started reading. And if I were to read his background and the achievements and the chances that he's taken and his the visionary aspect of his thinking and doing and writing and lecturing, teaching, organizing, I could be here a much longer time. And I still remember him as a young man. I keep thinking of it because even I was young then when we were together. As a matter of fact, it was during the time around 1963 that we met. And it was during the time that the young people at some of the more, well, I won't say progressive, they might have been in some ways, but they said, don't trust anybody over 30. Well, I was 30. And my wife and I started to get involved after I'd heard Martin Luther King for the first time lecture. I felt guilty that I wasn't doing something, so I started doing sit-ins and at Woolworths and the down off-Broadway plays, because they weren't hiring. You could buy a ticket, of course, but they wouldn't hire you as an actor, etc. So here I am in San Francisco, and I had come back to stay 3 weeks in '62, but I never went back to New York. I forgot, So here I am, and here we have crossed paths again. And through the years, I've been so busy doing what I do, and he's so involved in doing what he does, and continues to do until this day. And I would like to I take great pleasure in introducing you to you, Dr. Obitashaka. Let's bring him on.
Thanks, John. How's everybody doing? That was a beautiful panel that we just heard, and a lot of wisdom. And I want to say to all the panelists, I got a lot out of it. And Sister Erica Huggins, who has gone through hell and has matured as a very wise, spiritual woman. I think the advice she shared on the importance of going within yourself and drawing from your own power, I thought, of all the things that was said, that was the most important thing. This afternoon, I want to share with you a message on the San Francisco freedom movement that is often called the Civil Rights Movement. You'll see why in a minute. I think it's more appropriate to call it the freedom movement. It's a movement that people know virtually nothing about, and yet, of all the northern movements, it is the most significant, and we'll see why. I asked John Handy to do the introduction for a couple of reasons. He's a bad saxophone player. I mean, he's bad. As you know, in our culture, that means good. And in fact, I heard him play at Yoshi's a couple of years ago, and he was as good or better than when he was 30 or 40. I was hearing him blow, and I was saying, whoa. Bad. But there's two reasons that I asked him to do the introduction. One is he was a member of CORE, and he put his time into the movement. He was in charge of the Freedom Band, and as he just reminded me when we get into these slides later, he was among the first people arrested in the first mass action where arrest occurred in this city. So that was the first reason. But the second reason has to do with my topic. The topic is the San Francisco Freedom Movement, an act of culture. San Francisco Freedom Movement, an act of culture. And the main reason why I wanted him to introduce me is because what they call jazz, that's another term that we didn't define, but the music we have created, that this movement, which was an act of culture, as all our movements are, jazz is its highest expression because it's the highest classical expression of African American culture. And in fact, the most complex thinkers that we have, the Malcolm X's and the Toni Morrisons, are inspired by jazz. Are y'all hip to this? So, civil rights movement, as they call it, what I prefer to call the Black freedom movement, an act of culture. San Francisco had a movement, and most of you don't even know about it. When it comes time to talk about civil rights movements, people roll out the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who was a great leader and whose legacy is not appropriately appreciated because his I Have a Dream speech does not encapsulate what he represented, because by the end of his life, he was a revolutionary. And that message is lost when we get a picture of his I Have a Dream, which was a magnificent speech, but did not really represent where he grew to and what he became. But the San Francisco Civil Rights Movement was a product of the Southern Civil Rights Movement. And so before I get into this movement, I want to talk about its backdrop, because without the Southern Freedom Movement, inappropriately called Civil Rights Movement, there would have been none in San Francisco. And very often it's portrayed as a civil rights movement, but it was an act of culture. And the thing about this movement is it drew on the strongest aspects of African American culture. I prefer to call this New African culture, because what happened in our enslavement process is we recreated a culture here based on African foundational principles. And so the movement that you see coming out of Montgomery, and I was in high school when that movement took place, and more than anything, it reached out and told me I needed to be doing something for my people. It was an expression of culture. If you look at New African culture, it has many components. It's a complex culture. It's a beautiful culture. But at its heart, John Coltrane said this: to understand African American culture, you got to understand it rests on freedom. Get this straight, freedom. That's why it's more appropriate to call this a freedom movement. I heard Angela Davis speak last night, make the same point, and I agree with her. Because most people in the so-called civil rights movement weren't lawyers, didn't look at the Constitution from a legal standpoint. They were simply concerned with the fact that as 90-year-olds, they were treated like boys or girls. And they had no treatment of dignity coming from white folks, and they were treated as enslaved Africans. And so in the Montgomery Bus Boycott, which was the opening phase of the movement, this was at first, above all, an expression of freedom. But we got to understand something. Our culture has a different definition of freedom than the Euro-American culture. And we often confuse the two. And that's why Crispus Attucks ended up in a bind, getting killed in the American Revolution for freedom. He didn't understand that it was the freedom of George Washington to enslave him and the rest of black folks. He didn't understand that George Washington meant the freedom to enslave Africans, exterminate Native Americans, steal the land of Mexicans. That's what he meant. That's why he was the richest white boy in the country, and you call him, some of you do, the father of your country. But even if you look like him, you don't own what he owned. And basically, he owned us. You understand? So old Crispus didn't understand the African definition of freedom. And this is what this movement was driven by. Dizzy Gillespie, see, that's why I wanted John up here, one of our great philosophers, you know, this great trumpet player, innovator of black classical music. He said, to understand the African-American conception of freedom is to understand it's based on contradictory principles. And he went on, and you got to understand this because to understand the movement, you got to understand the culture of the people. And basically the culture of the black folks that made this movement, they be blues people. You understand? And these blues people that made up this culture of Montgomery, Alabama, or Mississippi, or Birmingham, or all these other movements, or San Francisco, these blues people were spiritual people because the spirituals are the blues. See, a lot of people think the spirituals came first and the blues came second. But if you hear the spirituals singing, soon I'll be done with the troubles of this world, going home to live with God, 90% of that song is the blues. It's about the troubles of this world. God is only one small part, and you will hardly ever see Jesus in the spirituals because most of us weren't Christians at that time. We were practicing some form of African religion that some of us call voodoo or hoodoo, which just means God. You hear what I'm saying? For almost 300 years. So you got to understand, and our mentality of freedom is this twin notion that wherever there's the spiritual, there's the physical, the sacred, the secular. And so with us, there can be no freedom. Dizzy said this, to understand the black conception of freedom is to understand that it is based on contradictory elements of discipline and freedom. Because the African mentality is twin. It never sees things one way. Plato saw it as good or bad. We see it as where there's good, there is bad. And we've seen enough of things pretending to be good that were really bad that we really are experts on it. Am I telling the truth? Huh? The sanctified, sanctimonious presidents who sit in office like Ronald Reagan, who were scripted in everything they did, could grin and make people hungry, make people poor, drive them into oppression. So we understand this hypocrisy. Martin Luther King didn't understand exactly the definition, but he came out of the culture. And he made the same observation. He said, it's amazing to see the discipline of a people so bent on freedom. He was describing the essence of our concept of freedom, which is freedom ain't free. Freedom takes a price. Frederick Douglass said the price of freedom is struggle. You hear me? Freedom is not free. But then Dizzy went on and he made another point. He said this. He said, to understand the African-American conception of freedom, you must understand that it is based on the contradictory principles of spontaneous organization. The civil rights movement was like Miles Davis, when he went into a recording studio, he had 3 notes. And he had nearly lost his voice, so he would say, all great music, he'd put it this way, all great music starts with what you know, then you go beyond yourself. And so after 3 notes, he went beyond himself and he would compose master music. That was the way the movement was composed, as the slave narrative said, on the spur of the moment. Except there was prior planning. So when Rosa Parks said, hell no, because she was a great-granddaughter of a Garveyite, she was proud of being black. She said she liked Martin Luther King, but she loved Malcolm X. See, that's a picture Rosa Parks usually haven't heard about her. This was a woman who never took no mess. You understand? But the point is, on the spur of the moment, a thing kicked off, like jazz kicks off, like hip-hop kicked off in the Bronx, you know, with Kool Herc and all the rest of those cats, you know what I mean? The same thing. So you got to understand, for us, and this isn't just how we do a movement, this is how a black cook cooks. They get in the kitchen and you ask them what they're going to cook, and they cook it on the spur of the moment. You understand? A good black mechanic, they'll listen to the sound of your car and they'll fix it on the spur of the moment. You understand? In fact, the hardest thing with black people is for black people to predict what black people are going to do. You hear me? Because, in fact, Rosa Parks said 2 weeks before the Montgomery Bus Boycott, she didn't think black people would ever get together because we're so hard to get together. And she didn't know she would be the very heart of this movement. By the way, she represented the best of the culture, a kind, genteel, nice, tough black woman. You understand? And if you want to talk about what Southern civility is, it's African culture. And the funny thing is, white people have taken it on without internalizing the civility. They have the surface of the civility. They got that Southern accent, that Mr. and Mrs. And when they come to lynch you, it doesn't matter what they call you. As Dick Gregory said, if they're a liberal racist, they hang you from a high tree. And if they're a conservative racist, they hang you from a low tree. But either way, you get hung. You hear what I'm telling you? So the thing is, we got to understand that this movement was driven by culture. But I want to say this. We didn't look at it that way then. Because then our scholars had a debate about whether we even had a culture. Malcolm X wasn't even sure about it, and Malcolm was on the cutting edge of our thinking, and he was reading the scholarship that was saying that, well, some of us, many of the scholars said, we lost our culture in slavery. And most blacks who were doing the movement, they weren't thinking, I'm joining a culture. The culture is making the movement. They were just doing it because this is a lived culture. The way you know black culture is to be it. And African thought, they say, to know the truth is to be the truth. So the embodiment of the culture was in the action. Now, this is the other thing about this movement. Really ain't appropriate to call it a civil rights movement. It was also a democratic movement. But not the democracy of American hypocrisy, because this is not a democracy. This is a republic. In fact, Aristotle, one of their so-called great philosophers, said he preferred aristocracy, but the best form of government would be a republican form, because people, when they got the vote, would think they were empowered. But he said, guess what? When they voted, they would vote for the same people. Y'all get that? One scholar in this country says you have one party, two wings, both right wing. That's Democratic and Republican, both right wing. You understand? And if you think there's a big difference in the sequester that's going on right now, you should go up underneath the surface. Both of them have reached the same agreement. They're going to cut the same poor people. And they're going to hardly do nothing to hurt the rich. But they're going to make it look like they'll do a little. It's a shell game. It's a con game. But the point is, this freedom movement was a democratic movement because New African culture, because it rests on African principles, is democratic to the core. Jazz has been described as an aristocratic democracy with no government in charge. What does that mean? Counts, Bassies, Dukes, Ellertons, Queen, Lady Days, you understand? King Martins, Prince Malcolms, you understand? Queen Mothers, you know, Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, and most of you don't know it. We have a Queen Mother in this movement. She was the mother of this movement. She's known for other things, but when she died and they had their ceremony at City Hall right across from here, and Dianne Feinstein officiated, they did not note her most singular achievement, Ella Hill Hutch, who was the mother of the San Francisco Civil Rights Movement. You hear me? And I am what I am because she was my mother's best friend and got this brainwashed Negro who was in his 12th year or the last year of college, 4th year at San Francisco State, and said, at that time my name was Bill Bradley, you should go to a CORE meeting. And I said to myself, CORE what? And I went to that first meeting, and I realized something important was happening. You understand? But you got to understand, this movement that kicked off in Montgomery, that spread across this country, and that this movement here was like central in terms of carrying out, this was a democratic movement based on African concepts of democracy. The reason why Rosa Parks said she didn't think nothing would happen in Birmingham, in Montgomery, is because we're democratic people. We're very hard to organize. We don't like anybody over us telling us anything. So how are you going to get us together? This is hard. In fact, the president, when he unveiled the statue to Rosa Parks, he did his homework. He said, this lady here didn't like nobody telling her to do anything. You hear me? We're all like that. Black folks are like that because we come out of cultures that are not only based on democracy, but they're based on consensus-based democracy. That means everybody's got to agree. That's African culture. And that was the culture of most of the civil rights movement, the best parts of the movement, not only the civil rights or freedom movement, it was a consensus-based democracy. If we look at the Montgomery Bus Boycott, King made this statement. He said, I didn't start this movement. I didn't organize this movement. But when the people called on me, I stepped forward as a spokesperson for the movement. At our best in the movement, the best leaders were not the ones who lorded over the people. They were the ones who were mouthpieces of what the people wanted. And I'm here to tell you today, if you put a movement out there again, and we're going to have to, given how the poor are being marginalized in this country, the way that you're going to be able to dismantle this system is put the power in the hands of the people. Do you hear what I'm telling you? Put the power in the hands of the people. And the most important people to empower are the most oppressed because they have the least at stake in this system. The San Francisco Civil Rights Movement was powerful because it operated on this principle of consensus-based democracy. Norman Brown, who's here, I'm going to acknowledge in a minute, made the point that our decisions were always made as a collective, meaning it had to be 100% agreement. And a lot of people will say, you really can't get anything to happen when you do things like that. But the fact is, your best ideas happen when everyone has put their ideas in the pot, and then you come up with the best ideas, which is the consensus of the group. So this movement was based on consensus-based democracy. But the most important thing I want to say about the Southern movement and the Northern movement, not only the freedom movement, the Black Power movement, Black Panther movement, the Pan-Africanist movement, the Afrocentric movements to come. The most important gains of these movements, the Southern movement broke up Southern-style apartheid, the denial of the right to vote, legal segregation, broke that up. Did not break up white supremacy. Did not break up the power of whites who still control the minority that control this system. But it was the first major defeat that white supremacists faced. And you may not understand it. There's a new right wing in this country. There's an underground right wing that's armed, and there's an overground right wing that's in the Tea Party, that's in the House of Representatives, that's operating at local, state, and national levels. And these people feel that they're on the defensive because they got their behinds kicked in the 60s. And they cannot accept any part of that because, as far as they're concerned, the ideal American system is one of white supremacy where whites rule and blacks are simply on the bottom and ground into the dust. So we can see one reason why this Congress hasn't worked. Whatever your criticism of Obama is, and I have some real criticism, the main problem is these white supremacists can't get over the fact that somebody's in there that ain't white, that happens to be black. He may not be all that ideologically black, or he may be more ideologically black than he acts. But the fact of the matter is he's black. And if you look at that Senator McConnell, every time you look at that man, he's reeking with hate. He can't even put a smile on his face. And so I'm not satisfied with the Obama administration, and most importantly, I'm not satisfied with us because we should have put it to him as soon as he got elected. Should have stuck it to him and put our agenda out there waiting until the second term when he can do what he wants to do. But I think it's still not too late to put your agenda out there. But the point is, this movement came out of that kind of thing. But the most important gain of this movement was the reconstruction of the African mind. This was the most important gain. And I might say that as the African mind got reconstructed, the brown mind got reconstructed. A lot of white youth got their minds reconstructed. Because what happened in the course of the struggle, the movement became a great classroom. And the stuff that many of us were brainwashed in universities or brainwashed in Mississippi or Alabama, as we began to confront intense, strong senses of power structures, what we were able to do is pull the wool off not only the Klan, but off the federal government. And we began to see the nature of who our friends are and who our enemies are. And it led us to begin to think for ourselves, in many cases for the first time, and to think beyond the system, to think outside the system, and to reconstruct our own sense of identity. And that was the most important gain. So the San Francisco Civil Rights Movement, it was a product of this movement. But let me say a few things about it, because most of you don't know anything about it. It's the largest of the northern civil rights movements. It took us 3 years to build a movement. I chaired San Francisco Corps. There's a brother named Will Ussery who was chair before me. There was a brother named Dr. Nathaniel Burbridge. When I do these PowerPoint later, I'll show you pictures of him, two-time PhD in pharmacology and in medicine, head of the NAACP, one of only 4 militant heads of an NAACP chapter in the United States. A young sister named Tracy Sims, who was 18 years old, a dropout from San Francisco State, who led the UC Berkeley contingent called the Hoc Committee. Now, the thing about this movement is it was the largest of the northern civil rights movements. By 1964, we put 10,000 people in the streets for a whole year. And it was a 5-year movement. It took 5 years. This was not a minute. In my case, it was full-time organizing for 5 years. There were other people like me, and then there were people who worked, who put the time in they could, and their time was just as valuable as people who put in full time. That's the thing about building a movement. Different strokes for different folks. People have different skills. You draw on those skills. So the first thing is it's the largest of the northern movements. The second thing is what you need to understand about San Francisco is this was a system that faced economic apartheid. Whereas the South faced political apartheid, here in San Francisco, in Oakland, in Richmond, in Vallejo, up and down the state of California, wherever you had black people, they were in a city, but they were outside the economy, more than anything. You could go and eat in a restaurant, you couldn't work there. You could go buy some clothes in a department store, you couldn't work there. You could go stick your bank in a bank account, but your money in a bank account, but you couldn't work there. Where did you work? You sweep streets, you shine shoes, and up until 1940, you hustled. There was a strong group of hustlers here in San Francisco, and they hustled white people up to 1940. Had one guy, I got this information from Julian Richardson and Tom Fleming and people who had the history, went in and interviewed them. And there was one brother that had him a big old cross. And his hustle was white people. And what he would do with his white hustle is tell him he's going to build a temple. And he got all kinds of money to build a temple that never materialized. And he financed other hustlers. You see? They were big-time hustlers. You know what I mean? Not small-time. And then you had people like a guy named, now this could only be a black person, Raincoat Jones. Could only be a black person. Raincoat Jones operated off of 7th Street, and he was a gambler. He was a crook, but gambling ain't as crooked. I mean, you can go to Vegas, that's legal. You know what I mean? And he would have a gambling shop. He made millions of dollars. And then he had a pawn shop because you were broke, so, you had to pay him off. So give me your watch or whatever you got, your little gold ring or whatever. You know what I mean? But this is Raincoat Jones. He sent hundreds of black kids to UC Berkeley, to various universities. And when the Sun Reporter was going to go out of business, Raincoat Jones pulled together a bunch of crooks, and they came up with $10,000, which in the late 30s was like $300,000 or $400,000 now and gave it to the Sun Reporter and saved them from going out of business. The point is that in this time, crooks were black. Crooks even had a black culture. And there were certain things they didn't do in the black community. Now we got crooks that haven't got the slightest understanding of any kind of blackness. You know what I'm talking about? Who will do anything to almost anybody other than their mama, and you wonder if their mama's free from anything happening to them. So the thing is, this was the largest of the movements. Second thing about this movement, and it took on economic apartheid. Now, the thing about the economic apartheid that we took on the entire economic power structure. You don't know about this movement, but if you got a job, you better believe you didn't get hired because white people like you. You better believe they did not hire you because you're qualified. Because please believe me, the people there were even more qualified than a lot of you now are. Some of them with 2 and 3 degrees. I told you about Dr. Burbridge had 2 PhDs. Wasn't enough to get one, he had to have 2. And it took all of that to become the first black professor at UC San Francisco. So the thing is, we took on the entire economic power structure, kicked their behinds, that means beat them, and didn't lose a single battle. That's point 2. Point 3 is, the San Francisco Civil Rights Movement gave birth to the free speech movement. The free speech movement, for those that don't know, was the movement at UC Berkeley where white students wanted to pass out civil rights literature, and because they were not allowed, they then started a free speech movement. And they took over the university. And in fact, it took years later for the UC administration to try and uproot radicalism from every arm of UC Berkeley, including black studies, because these students had become emboldened. And this free speech movement spread from UC Berkeley across the United States, and in 1968, it inspired the French student movement that nearly overthrew the French government. But we have black people saying we don't have any power. You understand? Because we don't understand something. See, these UC students weren't just inspired by the activism because they were our shock troops in some of our biggest demonstrations. That radicalized them, but they were also inspired by our culture. They used a consensus-based democracy in making their decisions. And Mario Savio, who was their first leader, was radicalized by being arrested at our first mass demonstration you'll see up here in a minute at the Sheraton Palace Hotel. So that's the third thing about this movement. This movement is the mother of all the other movements. There would probably not be a black studies department at San Francisco State except for the San Francisco Civil Rights Movement, because when students were arrested at the Sheraton Palace, one of the big mass demonstrations, they, while they were in jail, conceived of the experimental college. The experimental college became a funding arm that funded people like Sonia Sanchez, Amiri Baraka, and others who came out to state and began to teach black studies before there was black studies. So this movement, which we didn't intend for it to do, helped to lay the foundation for black studies. Most of the students who led the strike in 1968, I walked the strike, but they led it, don't even know this. They don't know where the birth of this came from. The San Francisco Civil Rights Movement helped to give birth to, made a major role in contributing to the black arts and cultural movement. Dengani, a brother who was then called Joe Goncalves, was chair of the Education Committee in San Francisco Core. He later founded a bookstore called New Day Bookstore and then founded a journal called the Journal of Black Poetry. It's the cutting-edge journal of the black arts and cultural movement of the 60s. Dengani still is alive in Atlanta, Georgia. I talked to him about 3 weeks ago. Dengani wrote the introduction to my book, The Political Legacy of Malcolm X, one of the quietest brothers, one of the deadest personalities, and one of the smartest people I ever knew. You hear me? Joe Goncalves. And then we had a executive at large who very rarely talked, because when I talk to people, I say, now, what did he ever say? He never said hardly anything. He was a very unassuming, humble person. He was in charge of our Public Relations Committee. His name was Donald Cox. He later became known as DC, Field Marshal for the Black Panther Party. And when I talked to Benny Stewart, who was chair of the Black Students Union, he said, of course, this is debatable. We got any Panthers in the room, they might not want to hear this. He said he was the best Panther. The thing about him was he was disciplined, well-organized, quiet, soft-spoken, and serious. The only problem is he called me up trying to sell me guns on the telephone. I'd say, come on, DC, hang the phone up. I said, the FBI's got my phone bugged, you understand? Even though the guns he was selling was legal. And I'd let him hold meetings in my headquarters where he would train Panthers in the use of guns. That was legal, you know what I mean? That's fine, you know what I mean? And DC ended up in exile in France, died last year. Because if he came back, they would have had him in jail for the rest of his life for killing an agent he didn't kill. So the point is, this was a cutting-edge movement, and it was the cutting edge of black nationalism. San Francisco Core led the black nationalist movement inside the civil rights movement, first group to move to black nationalism in 1965. So this is the background of this movement, but you don't know about it. You understand? And you might ask yourself, why don't you know about it? Well, one reason is some of the biggest demonstrations we had, even I had forgot a few of them, because when I went back doing the research, some of the research wasn't there. And then when I read our newsletter, because we had a newsletter we put out called The Correlator, it would note that some of these employers had forced all the newspapers not to report on this. You know what I mean? But enough of this was reported because we're on TV almost every night. But the point is, a lot of you don't know. If you weren't here at that time, you don't know. Some of you don't want to know because you associate the civil rights movement with integration. And you don't think, therefore, it's radical. But the fact is, the people of Montgomery who fought, the people here who fought, we didn't have any idea of integration. What did that mean? All we wanted was jobs for black folks. Because when we went down the streets, at Core's position, in 1960, we were organized. And in 1960, Ella Hutch and a guy named Bob Slattery put this organization together. And we met in her two-room apartment. Ella Hill Hutch, who later became the first black woman elected to the Board of Supervisors, always lived in a two-room apartment that you could barely lay yourself out in. Ella did not care about money. Ella cared about her people. She died at 59 years of age because she was always getting up and going, taking care of the needs of her constituents as a member of the Board of Supervisors when she should have been asleep, taking care of business. But the fact is, CORE then became like the cutting edge of the San Francisco civil rights movement. And so what had been a community that did not exist in the 30s, you had no black community. With World War II, black people flooded into the Fillmore, flooded into the Hunters Point to work in wartime factories, and flooded into Oakland. And so over 40,000 black people, a community that was 5,000 strong is 40,000 strong. And you end up in 1946 with a guy named Charles Augustus starting a Don't Buy Where You Can't Work jobs campaign in the Fillmore, demanding jobs for merchants that would take our money but not hire us. That campaign had been fought in Harlem by Adam Clayton Powell earlier and had been fought in Chicago before that by a man named Sufi Muhammad. And it spread to us in 1946. This was the forerunner of the San Francisco civil rights movement. So CORE, its strength was this. This is something, again, that's not generally understood. It's not just CORE. It was the strength of the movement. A lot of people think that most people have a price. Give them enough money, they'll sell out. That's an assumption. That's a common assumption because a lot of us worship dead presidents, even though the dead presidents aren't worth the paper they're printed on. And so I'm not just saying this of CORE. This was true of SNCC. This was true of large elements of SCLC. This was true of the Black Panther Party, especially in its first phase and many chapters throughout the United States. This was true of many in the Black Power movement, and it was this. In CORE, we had an unspoken agreement. Norman and I talk about this a lot. It was that the jobs we were fighting for, and I want to point this out, Norman Brown, who's here, raise your hand, Norman. Norman was a cab driver, you know what I mean? We had people in CORE who didn't have jobs. And we had some people who were highly skilled. We had a PhD in speech pathology. Lucille Jones. We had a PhD in space technology, Woodrow Jones. But then, the average person we had was off the streets. We had some people who were college dropouts, some people were in college, some people who had no college, some people who couldn't read. And I only found out years later that they couldn't read. You know what I mean? But the fact is, a lot of those members needed jobs, but the understanding was those jobs were not for us. The movement in this city, and that was true of most of the movement across this country, was selfless, and the people in it were not in it for their own benefit. This is important. You may not really understand how important this is. But when you have a movement, and CORE was never larger than 100 people, but that was enough to ignite a movement much larger. That's all you need to really turn out a city. 100 well-organized people, When you have people who say, there's nothing that the people in power can give them that they want, that means they can't be bought off. You understand? And when you got a group that can't be bought off, that means they'll go to any extreme to get what they have to get. The Panthers had that, that feeling. King had that feeling. When King got the Nobel Prize, he got enough money to retire on. He told his wife, that's going to the movement. Not a penny's going to our family. She said, well, why can't a few dollars go for education? He said, no, this is for the people. Malcolm got paid no more than $750 a month, wouldn't even have the mortgage to his house put in his name, which was a mistake. He should have, because he thought the messenger would take care of him. If anything went wrong, he'd take care of his family. A man and a woman, they're the ones that take care of their family. Don't rely on anybody else to do that. That was a mistake. But it was not a mistake for Malcolm to say that when leaders place money first, they think about money and forget about the people. But the key point about this is the commitment that this band of people that made up CORE, that made up the movement, had meant that we piped into something bigger. And that something bigger was a cause bigger than any of us. And that enabled us to expand our minds, to expand our consciousness. So the San Francisco Civil Rights Movement went through phases. In building a movement, it takes time. And so in the first phase, even with 100 members, you can't take on a power structure. So we formed alliances in the Hunters Point with the Bayview Hunters Point Citizens Committee, which was made up of welfare rights women. And it was a sister named Ardith Nichols. You'll see the picture up here in a minute. And that was to forge an alliance with the Hunters Point because we had a base in the Fillmore. We wanted unity between both black communities, and it took time. I went to our chapter and said, we need an alliance or a coalition with the ministers. And our members said, hell no. Those preachers got to sell you out. And they were right. In the end, we did get sold out. And I wasn't surprised that it might happen. But the fact is, in the meantime, if we're going to take on employers for jobs, we can't very well get black people to stop buying where we're not working if we don't have the people who the people respect telling them not to go there. And so we forged an alliance with the Baptist Ministers Union. And during the time in which we had that alliance, we controlled it. 45,000 black church people. So that when we took on the downtown department stores in 1963, when Kennedy was assassinated, it was a 3-month campaign of a Christmas boycott. And during that campaign, we took on a boycott against Sears Roebuck, Macy's, and Penny's. And Sears Roebuck had 50 black people out of 1,000. Macy's, Penny's, all the downtown department stores had hired absolutely nobody. But by the time we finished, we had busted open jobs for blacks, brown, and people of color. The other thing I want to point out is this. The San Francisco Civil Rights Movement didn't just fight for black people. They busted open jobs for people of color. And by the way, it's the only movement that forged a coalition with Chinese Americans and Mexican Americans and got them organized. You understand? And I often ask myself, why in the hell did I ever choose? Because I believe as a spiritual person, you pick your destiny. I believe you pick your time of birth. You pick where you're born. You may not, but I do. And I ask myself, why in the hell would I pick San Francisco? Ain't no black people here. You know what I mean? Why would I pick that? And then I figured it out. It's the miniature United States. If you can figure this one out, you can figure out the whole country. I'm a scholar and I'm a warrior, and mainly these movements are about learning stuff. And basically, that's all life is about learning stuff. You know what I mean? We're all here to learn stuff. Like the ladies were saying, learn stuff in relationships. You know what I mean? Learn stuff about how a society is put together. So if it's put together wrong, like Malcolm said, as crooked as a pretzel, you can straighten it out. It's a classroom for learning stuff. You know what I mean? So the thing is, this movement was about that. So as we formed alliances and coalitions, we formed, our closest one was with the NAACP. I've mentioned Burbridge. But a lot of people would think the NAACP, that ain't no organization. But Dr. Nathaniel Burbridge, you'll see his picture in a minute, he was a little soft-spoken, tough black man, very smart. And when they elected him head of the NAACP, I talked to Tom Fleming, who was editor of the Sun Reporter. He told me this. He said, Carlton Goodlett, I don't know if any people here know who he was, but he was the publisher of the Sun Reporter newspaper. He was a medical doctor and had a PhD in psychology, another one of these highly educated blacks, and he was a millionaire. And he was a socialist, if you could imagine that, a millionaire socialist. And when Paul Robeson was denied travel outside this country, it was Goodlett that did the travel, went to Russia, went to all those radical places. And when we had our movement meetings, it was always in Goodlett's office, and Goodlett was strong. And so we always had to steel ourselves, make ourselves strong, because Goodlett could always shift you. So we didn't want to be shifted by Goodlett. You understand? But the thing is, in this movement, Goodlett played a very important role, in terms of seeing that there was support for the movement. And, was very, very strong in terms of supporting the movement. So the thing is, as we forged these coalitions and, with the NAACP, Burbridge is the guy we formed a coalition with. And the people in the NAACP, they elected him because he had 2 PhDs. He's light complexion. And you see these Negroes in that time placed something on that. From Louisiana. They figured they got a Negro. You know what I mean? And Goodlett said this, those Negroes have made a big mistake. In electing Burbridge, that was a big mistake. And so I talked to a friend, his name was Reginald Major. Reginald Major had a son in the Black Panther Party. He wrote a book called A Panther is a Black Cat. He died last year. Reginald taught at San Francisco State. Reginald was a Marxist. He was a friend of James Baldwin as well. And Goodlett calls up Reginald Major and he says, I want you to join the NAACP. He says, I'm not joining these house Negroes. He said, these little backward Negroes, I ain't joining. And what he said was, only way I'm coming in is if you turn this organization out. 1 week later, Burbridge called and said, we're going to turn this organization out. And so the NAACP was a group that we had the closest ties with. Burbridge was one of 4 militant heads of the NAACP in the 60s. Robert Williams, that took up guns in Monroe, a guy named Cecil Moore in Philadelphia, and the brother who was murdered in Mississippi, Medgar Evers. He's in that rank. And he set up the medical system in Indonesia. And when Sukarno saw him there, he thought he was another house Negro. And then he realized this was a radical black man. So when Sukarno, who had been president of Indonesia, who was overthrown by the American government, and they murdered 1 million of his people, UC Berkeley people were put in charge of Indonesia. When he came to San Francisco, the first person he wanted to see was Burbridge. So we formed a coalition. In 1963, Birmingham kicked off. And I remember there's a guy, Will Essery, who was chair of San Francisco Corps before me. He came back from Birmingham. He had these long jeans on because in the movement you wore jeans. And he had a Dizzy for President button on, which I thought was a good idea. Dizzy would have definitely made a better president than any of those presidents. And so King had a campaign called Operation Confrontation. He took on the whole power structure. You're familiar with it, where the dogs would suck on children. It was children that made that movement. But the key thing about Birmingham was Birmingham defined the power structure as the enemy. And we had been building a movement for 3 years. And so we decided this is the time to build a united front. And I'm going to tell you something. To build a black united front, or any kind of front, is not easy because the biggest obstacle is organizational egos. I helped build a group called the National Black United Front. And it could not be an organization of organizations because of the egos. The biggest groups wanted to turn it into a debating society. So we had to turn it into an organization of members because of that. But in San Francisco, we were able to build an organization of organizations. By that time, the preachers had left us. They betrayed us. But they had served their purpose. But the thing is, by then, we had the NAACP, we had the Ad Hoc Committee, we had the Negro American Labor Council, we had CORE, we had the NAACP. The key to building a Black United Front was this: we decided to bury our egos. And this is the key thing. When you place your people first, you realize that ego is phony. Ego's not real. It's like a balloon. You puff it up and prick it, it explodes. And a lot of our movements went down because of egos. You understand what I'm telling you? The FBI got in there and played with movements based on organizational egos. My philosophy has always been this: in any movement that I lead, ain't nobody going to get hurt because of my ego. And besides, I'm in groups that make the decisions collectively anyway, and I tell people this: don't follow me, follow the truth. You hear what I'm telling you? And I tell my wife, I love her. I love God. I love my family. But you know what I love more than anything? The truth, baby. The truth. Because the truth is the most beautiful thing. And it will lead you in places where you least expect to go. So, we took on a power structure. But I want to, in wrapping up, point this out. We took on the Bank of America, the largest bank in the world. We had demonstrations against the Sheraton Palace, against the whole hotel and restaurant industry, and we took on Auto Row. That was a campaign led by the NAACP. But the most valuable thing in this movement were the lessons we learned. For me, the most valuable experience was a lunch that I had in a restaurant called Virginia's Restaurant. The black community supported us. We had a black community in the Fillmore before it was destroyed. You understand? And a lot of people say, where did black businesses go? They destroyed those black communities. Go to Harlem now and see if you can find one. You understand? Go to West Oakland, where you had thriving black communities. You understand? But the point is, we got fed in a restaurant called Virginia's Restaurant. It was a soul food restaurant right in the heart of the Fillmore. And I enjoyed my soul food twice a day. You know what I mean? My lunch and my dinner. It was good food. But I remember the most important food I got was sitting in that restaurant one day with Norman Brown, who's a good friend of mine. And I'm in my second year of law school. Graduated from San Francisco State. I'm leading the largest of the northern movements. We're cleaning clocks. We're kicking behinds. And Norman Brown is explaining to me how the system works. And I'm a government major. And I realized I didn't have a clue. I realized that I had been programmed. I had been trained, not educated. My mind was on a plantation. You understand? And it was the first time that I had an experience of mental freedom because I was thinking for myself for the first time. Now, Norman didn't know it. He had aimed his message at my level. My father had been telling me the same thing, but I didn't get the message. But he aimed it at my level, and I kept saying, I know. That was my favorite saying at that time anyway. I know. And I'm saying to myself, oh, shit. Oh, shit. Because if I don't know my enemy, I don't know myself. And there's two rules in war. You got to know yourself. You got to know your enemy. And so it was that experience that led me to hit the books. It was that experience that led me to go to Marcus Bookstore, which became the university for a whole lot of black people in this area. The university that trained Asa Hilliard, that Wade Nobles, a host of our best scholars, and a whole lot of other people who you may not know, who know more than a lot of the best scholars. They went and hit the books because real education is self-education. It's not the education you get in a university, though that's important. If you get it in a university, if you're not inspired to read outside of a university, you're being trained, you're not being educated. You know what I'm telling you? You hear what I'm saying? When I go around the country and speak, the place where I bring the least amount of books to sell is colleges because they don't buy them. But if I go to a church or a community center, they buy books because it's grassroots people who read. The most miseducated ones are the functionally illiterate ones, the ones who got the paper and think that once they got the paper, they don't need to know anything else except what's in the comic strip or what's on the sports page. You understand what I'm saying? Not true for all, but it's true for too many. So the re-education process, Malcolm went through the same thing. Realizing who his enemy was, it opened his eyes up. And it led us to then hit the books and to begin to rediscover who our enemy is and who we are. Most important to understand who we are. The other thing was this. When we took on the economic system, we were successful in getting jobs for blacks and people of color. But the very success was a failure. You know why? Because many of us, James Foreman, who was executive director of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, made this in his book, Making a Black Revolutionaries. He's a great man. He died a few years ago. Great man. He made this comment. Not everybody in the movement became a revolutionary, but those who became a revolutionary were those who hit the books, those who did study, and those who began to look at themselves. Too many of our people assumed that when a job was opened up or we got the right to vote, all we had to do was get a job or go to Congress and we were free. But many of us concluded this as we did our homework. Yeah, we got jobs for blacks and people of color. But the fact is, the system itself is not structured to produce freedom for most people, if not all people. The conclusion that we reached was the system itself is crooked. The system itself has to be changed. And so in the process of that, a King became a revolutionary. A Malcolm X became more revolutionary. In fact, by the end of their lives, they were converging, contrary to Manning Marble, who said they didn't have much in common. Like hell they didn't. King said that this system's problem was structural, meaning it's structured to make the rich rich and the poor poor. Malcolm said that just as a chicken is not designed to produce a duck egg, America is not designed to produce freedom. He said if a chicken could produce a duck egg, it would be a revolutionary chicken. If America could produce freedom, it would be a revolutionary system. So in the end, not all of us became revolutionaries, but this was the classroom. And those of us who studied the hardest, those of us who dug into the culture at its deepest level, were able to draw some very valuable lessons. I can say for myself that all the things that I've done in my life, the most valuable thing is participating in this movement, because this movement was about serving something bigger than any individual person. This movement was a gigantic classroom in which it was everyday people who taught us. Norman Brown, who I give as an example right here, Norman comes from the same city that Zora Neale Hurston comes from. All black town. First all black town that black people organized, and then came out of New York where you got some of the highest political consciousness. My awakening was a product of culture, meaning someone who had come out of a rich culture of self-determination was getting somebody who had been raised in an all-white community, gone to all-white schools, had nothing but white teachers, to realize that, baby, you need to come back home. You understand? Get back rerooted in your culture. So I want to say this finally, that for today, our culture is our strength. The culture of black folks, the culture of every people in this country. It's the culture that you draw from that gives you a reason to live. It's a culture that gives you a purpose in life. And it's this culture that will change this system. Thank you.
That's fine. Hello, thank you so much, Dr. Tashaka. Let's give him another round of applause. So since we're running pretty far behind, we'll have one question. Okay.
Dr. Tashaka. Yeah, I recognize you, brother. How you doing?
We'd be remiss if we didn't mention the best organizer under the sun.
Tamatra Scott.
Well, no, Master Shabbat.
Oh, okay.
Master Shabbat. And what you talked about is a we mentality rather than a me mentality.
He's referring to a brother that ran a organization in the Fillmore that provided self-defense for various property owners and was run out of the country, ended up in Guyana for a number of years. His organization was patterned after the Black Panther Party, Nasser Shabazz. Yeah. That's it.
Is there one more question? Oh, that guy.
Coming out on this? That's a good question, yes. In fact, Norman and myself and some others have been talking, and we're going to pull together people who were involved in this movement. Dengani, or Jogan Calvis, who lives in Atlanta, has kept most of the records, so we're going to be putting out a book on this. I debated whether it would be a part of a larger book, but I think it deserves treatment on its own. So yeah, we are. I'm going to write it, but it's going to be all the people who are involved in it giving us their input. We have some interviews already, you know. Yeah. Can there be one more? Just one more. There was one other. Yeah, right. Yeah, right here.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I know that you mentioned the little town that Zora Neale Hurston came out of, and then you just said New York, but you're actually referring to Edenville, Florida.
Yeah, Edenville, Florida. Right. Are you from there?
I'm from Sarasota, Florida, so not far.
Oh, okay. Okay. Zora Neale Hurston, one of our greatest scholars, you know.
How important were the longshoremen and the labor? I guess many of the students were the children of longshoremen. How did that transition?
Did you hear that? How important was the longshoreman? That was a part that I had. I deliberately cut it out to save time. My father was a longshoreman, so I benefited directly from that. The IOWU organized a strike in 1937, and that strike was designed to see that the ILWU could be organized as an independent union. Harry Bridges, who was in charge of that union, who was an Australian, went to the black community and told them that if blacks supported the strike, they'd get jobs. And by the end of that strike, blacks supported it. When the strike was over, 50% of the jobs on the waterfront went to blacks. And those were the best jobs that black people had in the Bay Area. They were dangerous jobs, especially during World War II, but they were the best paying jobs. Before that, blacks had been confined to two areas on the docks, the Panama Pacific line and the Lusendorf line. Those are the only lines blacks were allowed to work on. After that, the docks opened up. The IOWU played a role in the Don't Buy Where You Can't Work jobs campaigns. They provided a good part of the picketing. Some churches, some black churches, opposed them because they accused them of being communists. Some of them were, so what difference did it make? And many of them were not, so what difference did it make? So, you know, they played an important role. But in the civil rights movement itself, they didn't play much of a role. And by the end of the civil rights movement, you ended up with automation on the docks, and so you ended up with a lot of people losing their jobs, and there were some real battles around trying to preserve jobs for black workers on the docks after that. But they had been a very important base of support in the 40s, in the 30s, and in the 50s, you know.
We'd like to thank the committee members that were here, and then Oba Tashaka, of course, Deanne Matthews, Mary B. Morrison, J.R. Valerie, Erica Huggins, the committee members, and Philip House. How are you doing? And if you enjoyed this program, you can let the library know. Thank you all for coming.
He's been a tireless advocate against white supremacy, against economic apartheid, as both a teacher, an activist, an author. Here's his 5 books, including his first one was on Malcolm X. One that we've been reading in the class a little bit is The Integration Trap. Also The Art of Leadership, Volumes 1 and Volume 2, as well as the masterwork, The Return to the African Mother Principle and Male-Female Equality. All of these books are very, very intense, and as well as doing other things. I know, talking to him yesterday, you mentioned to me you'll be speaking in Jamaica very, very shortly. We will talk about that. But I will shut up and just introduce him because there's a lot that he has to say, and he can say it way better than I can. So, Dr. Shaka.
I understand you all have been doing some reading on the integration trap, generation gap, caused by a choice between two cultures. Is that correct? You've been doing some reading on that? And you were supposed to come in with some questions. I got prompted on 2 questions that were really profound, and we'll see what some of the others are. So what I wanted to do this afternoon, give you a little background on myself, but mainly I wanted to focus on some things that have to do with where our people have been, African Americans, but also people of color and people who are oppressed in this country. They're not always of color. Where we've been, some of the struggles we've been through, and then some projections in terms of what we need to deal with today. I'm a spiritual scholar warrior. What that means is my best ideas have come from the spirit. In fact, as an organizer, I've been an intuitive organizer all my life. I've never lost a battle. And if you do that, you have to give credit to something beyond yourself. I don't lose. The system has tried to take me out 3 times, FBI. This finger, 18 people came after me. Assassin came to shoot me, and they sent a major operative into my organization. That's called counterintelligence program, to take my group out. I'm a counterintelligence specialist, meaning I study spycraft. The Americans are not good at spying, CIA, Central Ignorance Agency. However, if you're not up on your job, they will take you out. They took King out, they took Malcolm out, they took Fred Hampton out, but they tried to take Castro out 400 times. Didn't take him out, you know what I mean? So I don't have a martyr complex. I respect Jesus Christ, but I ain't hanging on no cross. When my time comes, I'm gonna ask God for more time. Lord, I got more work to do. I am not dying at the hands of my oppressors. With a lovely wife and with lovely people, no way. So my scholarship is based on activism, and it's the activism that really re-educated me, and because I was miseducated through European education. Student at San Francisco State, I went to Hastings Law School, got a PhD from the Western Institutions of Social Research. But during most of that education proved to be irrelevant. It was the San Francisco Civil Rights Movement, which is the mother movement of all the movements in California, preceding the Black Panther Party and other groups. It served as the classroom for me. So I'm going to start with this, and then I'm going to use myself as an example for some of the stuff you've been reading, and you get a clearer idea of what we're talking about. The San Francisco Civil Rights Movement occurred between 1960 and 1965. It was a 5-year movement, and I was in it for those 5 years. At the time in which this movement started, the only jobs a black person could get in San Francisco or Oakland or in the Bay Area was sweeping streets, shining shoes, working in the post office or the waterfront. All other jobs, and that was true for Mexicans, Latinos, Chinese Americans. All other jobs you were frozen out of. No jobs in the banking industry, no jobs in supermarkets, department stores. I don't care where they are, they were frozen out. So we call that economic apartheid. The Southern Civil Rights Movement faced political apartheid. They were denied the right to vote, they were segregated. In the North, we faced economic apartheid. This was the most effective movement for tackling economic apartheid. If you get a job, and most of you are going to college to get a job, you don't know it, but this movement busted those jobs open. And no member of this movement took a single job. Our unwritten rule was, and this wasn't just the San Francisco Civil Rights Movement. The Panthers had this commitment, Malcolm had this commitment, King, many people in the movement. Our unspoken rule was, those jobs are for the people, they're not for us. I didn't have a job, I was a full-time student. Really didn't want one for a while. But after a while, I couldn't get one. For 10 years, FBI saw no work for me. But we had people who were, a brother I'll talk about in a minute, who woke me up. He was a cab driver. He could have used a better job. We had and we had people who were unemployed. But those jobs were for the people. And as a result, what you had in this movement were people who didn't sell out. I have a rule as an organizer. I do not accept pay for any movement I lead, and I've led a lot of movements and created all kinds of money. I'm good at economic development. That money does not go to me. What that means is we're buyout proof. You can't buy us off. We don't want your money. We don't want your honey. You know what I'm talking about with honey? Send the pretty ladies on us. We don't want that either. You know what I mean? If it's the right lady, that's all right. But if they're being sent in for the wrong thing, forget it. So this is the first mass demonstration held by the San Francisco Civil Rights Movement in 1963, when I had just become elected chair of San Francisco CORE, Congress of Racial Equality. And these were demonstrations for open housing. At that time, this was in San Francisco, Select Rentals, 24th and Mission Street. It was a rental agency, and they would not give black people listings to, or brown, red, or yellow, to rent wherever they wanted to. So we were telling them they had to open up their listings. This brother here, can hardly see him, but his name is Kermit Scott. He's about 15 years older than me. He was my vice chair. Now I was only 23 at this time. He was older than me. He was a social worker. He ended up being the principal organizer for Ron Dellum's campaign for Congress, one of the best political organizers in the country. And so this is a demonstration at Select Rentals. It was the first time that any arrest occurred in the civil rights movement. Go ahead, next one. That's me when I'm 23 years old. Those are Ray Charles sunglasses on right there. Ray Charles was cool, you know what I mean? But those are sunglasses where you have no peripheral vision. So the police really want to do me in, so they said, if they could, they caught me driving with these glasses, they'd throw me in jail because I didn't have any peripheral vision. But that wasn't why, because they wanted to bust the movement up, so they went after the leadership. My name is now Oberta Shaka. At this time, I was chairing San Francisco CORE. I later became chair of the Western Region, which was 14 states within the Congress of Racial Equality, and I became treasurer of San Francisco CORE, National CORE later on, which was third highest ranking CORE. The leaders in this movement were myself, a sister named Tracy Sims, who was 18 years old. She was a dropout, San Francisco State. She led the group called the Hoc Committee. It would pull in a lot of UC Berkeley students. Dr. Nathaniel Burbridge, you'll see his picture in a minute. He was head of the NAACP. He had 2 PhDs, one in pharmacology, one in medicine. A little tiny guy, militant. He was one of only 4 militant heads of the NAACP in the 60s. He set up the medical system for Indonesia. He was a tough brother. In fact, this is his picture right here, The Art of Leadership, Volume 2. But you'll see him up on the screen in a minute. Go ahead. So this is where we were picketing. The guy said, I guess we'll stay closed rather than give you black people a listing so you can rent anywhere you want, or brown or yellow people, I guess I'll go out of business. And I said, if you're dumb enough to do that, we'll put you out of business. Go ahead. Go back. Well, no, you don't have to go back. That's okay. What ended up happening with him is he ended up not going out of business. He signed an agreement with us to provide open housing. But essentially, this was a movement. Part of movements is building relationships. Movements don't occur overnight. If you see a movement, because by 1964 we put 10,000 people in the street, it's years of building a movement like that. You don't put 10,000 people in the streets like that. So we've worked alliances and coalitions. Alliances are long-term relationships between organizations. My book, The Art of Leadership, deals with this in Volume 1. Coalitions are short-term relationships with organizations. So we had certain groups that we had long-term relationships with. One was the San Francisco NAACP. with Dr. Nathaniel Burbridge, and that was because he was principled. He wouldn't sell out. The Bayview Hunters Point Citizens Committee, you'll see a picture of this woman. She was a social worker in the Hunters Point, Ardith Nichols. Now these were black women coming out of poor black community, the Hunters Point, many of them on welfare. But this was the largest black community in San Francisco. The Fillmore, where San Francisco core, the NAACP was based, was the most militant of the black communities in the Bay Area. But the Hunters Point was the largest. So having a coalition with the Hunters Point was very important for black people. Because as far as I'm concerned, the most important thing you can do in a movement is address the issue of the poor. Poor blacks, poor brown, poor red, poor yellow, poor white. But first of all, it's a poor frog that don't praise its own pond. You gotta look out for your own, backyard first. But my concern has been with poor people, period, but especially black people. So the Bayview Hunters Point, this was a coalition, but it took years to build relationships here. And then San Francisco core, for a period of time, we formed a coalition with the Baptist Ministers Union that represented 45,000 black people in San Francisco. Many of our members didn't want that coalition. I'm the one that pushed it because they felt they would sell us out, and eventually they did. But my view was this: if we're going to boycott department stores, because remember there were no jobs for black people, how are you going to get black people to not go in those stores? You're going to need preachers to stand up in there and say, don't buy where you can't work. And we did get them to do that. So we formed a coalition with the Baptist Ministers Union led by the Reverend G.L. Bedford. And then we had a coalition with the Negro American Labor Council. This is an important group because it's made up of black labor. And it was led by one of the best organizers black people produced in the 20th century. His name was A. Philip Randolph. Anybody heard of him? Yeah. Anybody know what his main achievement was as an organizer?
He had the March on Washington.
He did call.
He was able to organize the Pullmans that's on the train, and he was able to get them a union.
That's very important. Pullman Car Porters Union. And then the biggest move he made was during World War II, blacks could not get jobs in defense industry. Everybody else had been hired, black, brown, red, yellow, white, no blacks. And so he threatened to march on Washington if Roosevelt did not come through with a Fair Employment Practices Commission that guaranteed that blacks would get wartime work. And so just with the threat of the March on Washington, Roosevelt made that concession, and blacks got jobs in World War II. So Harold Brooks was the leader in the Bay Area of this group. And then the Ad Hoc Committee, very important group, because Tracy Sims, you'll see her picture in a minute, 18-year-old SS State former student, she was head of it, but the membership came from UC Berkeley. And the San Francisco Civil Rights Movement would radicalize thousands of UC Berkeley students. Go ahead. So this is the coalition we formed with Ardith Nichols, the one that I just mentioned, Bayview Hunters Point Citizens Committee. This is Dr. Nathaniel Burbridge here, myself, and a guy named Frank Quinn, who was in charge of a citywide group that dealt with anti-discrimination. So here, we're supporting the Hunters Point on the issue of housing. They wanted low-income housing for black people in Hunters Point. So the NAACP and CORE, we supported them on that. Next one. This is Dr. Burbridge again, myself. This is a brother who led a campaign against Mel's Drive-In, which is a restaurant in San Francisco for jobs. But this was essentially a campaign we had against police brutality. This was part of building a movement because as today, as yesterday, the police run wild in our communities. And this was a move to try and check police violence. Go ahead. This is the coalition with the Baptist Ministers Union, Reverend Bedford, myself. And this was a major rally held around the time that we began to boycott downtown department stores that were not hiring blacks. Next one. Now, the San Francisco Civil Rights Movement, all civil rights movements in the North would not have happened but for the Southern Civil Rights Movement. The Southern Civil Rights Movement was the spark plug for all movements in the North. And the Birmingham movement was important, but the Montgomery Bus Boycott was really the kickoff. How many people have heard of the Montgomery Bus Boycott? Who was a key person in the Montgomery Bus Boycott that triggered it? Who? Rosa Parks. Does anybody know who she worked with in the NAACP in Montgomery? Anybody know the name of the person? No. It's a guy named Edie Nixon. Edie Nixon was a Pullman car porter, and he was one of the best organizers in Montgomery. Edie Nixon is the one that really picked King to be head of the Montgomery movement. Edie Nixon had the right to be head because he was the one that got Rosa Parks to agree that she would stand up and be a part of a test case against segregation on the buses. So you don't know. See, everyday people make movements. You think that it's just single great leaders, but it's everyday people. And in this particular case, Edie Nixon was one of those everyday people. So the San Francisco Civil Rights Movement was very much inspired by the Southern Civil Rights Movement. But we were addressing economics, they were addressing segregation and denial of the right to vote and public accommodations. So what happened is Birmingham is King's biggest campaign. It's called Operation Confrontation, and that's where these little kids have fire hoses shot at them, dogs thrown against them. But the story of Birmingham is without those little kids, there would have been no movement. Because Birmingham was also called Bombingham. And there was a guy named Bull Connor who was chief of police or head of public safety. And he would literally blow you up. They put dynamite under your house and blow you up. Fred Shuttlesworth, that was just mentioned, his house was blown up. He was the leader of that movement. So older people were afraid to demonstrate in Birmingham. And so it took King's best mobilizer, a guy named Reverend Bevel, to convince elementary and junior high school students to be the ones that would lead the movement. And you might say, well, that's awful young. But these young people, they didn't have to worry about losing a job, and young people tend to be fearless. So when I got a call from Birmingham, our organizer from Louisiana, Ike Reynolds, said, King's coming to town, he's going to call Birmingham off. The people are afraid to demonstrate. But he said, Reverend Bedford, he got these kids. The kids are ready to take on the system. And so King decided to do that. So Birmingham was a very powerful thing because it took on the economic, the political, the social, the educational, and the police power structure of Birmingham. And it led us in San Francisco. One of our members, Will Ussery, came back. He was in Birmingham, and he was there to figure out how could we unify all the different groups and build a united front. And so as a result of that, we built the United Freedom Movement. And it was made up of the groups that I just mentioned, CORE, NAACP, Ad Hoc Committee, the Negro American Labor Council. The ministers were no longer in it because by then they had sold us out. But we didn't need them anymore. They had served their purpose. And at the same time, while we were organizing the United Freedom Movement, we were boycotting downtown department stores for jobs and Lucky Supermarket for jobs. Go ahead, next one. Next one. Oh, you hit, yeah. No, that's good. So this is the United Freedom Movement, and it's Burbridge, Ardith Nichols, myself, Harold Brooks. Now, this is another thing about movements. Too many movements in the 60s, egos mess people up. My group is more important than your group. My leader is more important than your leader. And if that happened, the FBI was very good at coming in and dividing groups. One of the distinguishing features of the San Francisco Civil Rights Movement is we all had egos, we buried our egos. When we formed the United Freedom Movement, the logical person to head it would have been either me or this brother who had come back with the idea of how to form it, Will Ussery. We decided, I'm not chairing it, he's not chairing it, Burbridge is going to chair it. Why? He was older than us, he had 2 PhDs, we knew he wouldn't sell out, and he had more credibility in the community than we did. And we led most of the movements, and we had a lot of support. And we had more members. We could kick more butt. You know what kicking butt is? You know what I mean? But Burbridge was bad, and he was the best one, and then we made Ardith Nichols co-chair, because she came from the Hunters Point. So that gave us a Fillmore Hunters Point thing. So this was one of the key characteristics of this movement. We didn't have no ego differences, number one. And number two, we could submerge our egos enough not to lead a movement if someone else was in a better position. Now, I was in charge of the organizing committee. I'm a strategist. So I was orchestrating strategy. But I didn't have to be the leader. And that's the thing about leading. In African American culture, leading is following. In African American culture, the best leaders follow the just will of the people, not their ego, not what they can get, but what's in the people's best interest. Martin Luther King was among the best leaders. What did he say? I did not start the Montgomery Bus Boycott, but when the people called on me, I served as a spokesperson for the people. And just before his assassination, he said, don't talk about my Nobel Prize. He says, I was a drum major for freedom, meaning I was one of the troops out here. I was fighting for my people. And King made mistakes, he did some stuff, but he never sold out. And he never went for the money. He liked the honey, though. Next. This is when we took on the downtown department stores and Penny's and Macy's, but I'd forgot that we had also taken on another department store. And I forgot because there was no publicity. When I went back to look at a scrapbook that my mother, this all comes from my mother's record of the movement, I had forgot all about this particular one, Sears and Roebuck's. And the reason why I forgot is Sears and Roebuck's told all the newspapers they better not give any coverage to this boycott. But the boycott was 85% effective, meaning we nearly put Sears and Roebuck out of business. And so as a result, Sears and Roebuck decided to start hiring some black people and some people of color. And so we took on also Penny's. This was during 1963 during the winter, which is the best time for a boycott because people are buying stuff for Christmas. So we took on the stores that black people are most likely to go to, Penny's because it was cheaper, and then Macy's because it was vulnerable. And so when you saw that Baptist Ministers Union, that's when this worked. And they said, don't buy where you can't work. And those black people that started to cross the line, we told them, you ain't crossing this line. These jobs are for you, you ain't selling out. And so as a result, after about 2 months of demonstrations, we forced all the downtown department stores to hire black, brown, red, and yellow. Over 200 of them. Next. Now, we had in 1962 reached agreements with the supermarkets. None of them hired black people, Asians, Latinos, no people of color. Less than 1%. And so we told them that they had to substantially increase the hiring of people of color. Safeway went right on and started hiring people. We went back to Lucky's. Lucky's hadn't hired anybody. Maybe 20 people. They said that was enough. This is the whole Bay Area we're talking about now. I'm in charge of this campaign. So we decided that we would boycott Lucky's. But what happened is the main campaign was in San Francisco. It was on Gulf and Geary, and that was an area that the redevelopment agency had redeveloped and was nothing but white people up there. So when they walked through, they didn't honor a boycott. Now, I had the ministers on board for a boycott, and it was all over. Oakland, San Mateo, all over. East Palo Alto, you name it, we had the boycott. So I came up with a new strategy, and the strategy was we would go into supermarkets, fill up the grocery carts with groceries, and not buy anything. And I was a law student. I studied this, and I figured out this was legal. They can't arrest us. By the way, I don't like going to jail. The campaigns I led, only one person was ever really arrested. Almost all the other campaigns, a lot of people were arrested. Because, you know, putting people in jail, these are people that you need on the streets. The rule in war, and by the way, politics is war without bloodshed, is find your enemy's weakness and take him out. I'm a martial artist, so the same thing in martial arts. Find your opponent's weakness, take him out. But the real rule in war is win it without a fight. The majority of the battles we had no fight, because after we'd whip a few, the rest of them would fall in line. You know what I'm talking about? That's the rule they use against us. That's a rule you should learn how to use. So what we did is we stuffed all these carts with groceries. Hit the next one. Well, so what ended up happening is the ministers sold out on us on that because the downtown got to them and they said, well, you know, that was called a shop-in. That ain't right. And so the minister called me up. I didn't tell him we were going to shop in because I didn't think it was a big deal. You know what I mean? It's legal. You know what I mean? And it's effective. So, you know, we did a truce on the shop-ins, forced the mayor, who was then, his name was Shelley, we forced him to then negotiate an agreement with Lucky's that for 1 year, this was never put in public. Every single hire had to be black, brown, red, or yellow. Every single person they hired. Every one. You hear what I'm telling you? And those are the best jobs we busted open because those are union jobs. You get retirement. You get medical benefits, you know what I'm talking about? With a high school education or less. Hello. Now, we built the United Freedom Movement. And so as a result of that, we then took on 3 campaigns. One was the hotel and restaurant industry, which hired no blacks or people of color. The next was Auto Row, and then the next was the Bank of America. This campaign against the hotel and restaurant industry was led by the Ad Hoc Committee. UC Berkeley students came out on this. As a result of their radicalization, it would lead to the free speech movement. The San Francisco Civil Rights Movement gave birth to the free speech movement. How many people have heard of the free speech movement? What was the free speech movement?
So UC Berkeley speaking out, Mario Savio speaking against the administrators.
Right, the issue at UC Berkeley was that students wanted to pass out civil rights literature and the administration said no. And so as a result, then the students went on strike. Mario Savio was the principal spokesperson. His first arrest occurred at the Sheraton Palace. He got radicalized first at the Sheraton Palace, then he went to Mississippi during the Mississippi summer of 1964 and worked under the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Essentially, the students at UC Berkeley not only were radicalized, because for a year we had them demonstrating against the hotel and restaurant industry, against Auto Row, which didn't hire blacks to sell cars on Auto Row on Van Ness, and against the Bank of America. So when they went back, they'd been radicalized. But they weren't just radicalized around civil rights, they were radicalized in African American culture. Because what I haven't spoken of, and we'll get into this in a minute, it's a topic of choice between 2 cultures, is civil rights movement was an expression of African American culture. But I want to say this, most of us didn't know it. We were inspired by a culture because it's a lived culture. We were living it, but we weren't conscious that one of the principal ways, one of the reasons why we didn't lose any battles in the San Francisco Civil Rights Movement and many others was because we had what's called consensus democracy. That means our decisions required everybody to agree to it. And so whenever we're taking on a campaign, I orchestrated this like jazz where we would have 200 people debating what are we going to do. And in the end, we would come to a consensus decision. Strategy was never consensus. I'm the strategist. Strategy is next to love, the ultimate art. And you can't vote strategy. That's kind of like if you're in a fight, Muhammad Ali with James Foreman. Even his trainer didn't know his strategy. It was rope-a-dope, because Foreman was really better than him at that point. Foreman was stronger and everything else, so he had to wear him down. That was his strategy. You never give away your strategy. So anytime we took on a campaign, people didn't know what the strategy was until we laid it down. Because if your enemy knows the strategy, he can counteract you. But in terms of the policy, the group makes the decision. And usually African culture is democratic. So I'm explaining some stuff. I'm dipping into the integration trap. African culture is democratic. It starts with the Twa. Most of you haven't got that far in this book. It's chapter 2. They're the world's first people, came into being 144,000 years ago. They are the world's first people. All human beings come from them. The first people in China were Anu, A-I-N-U, Twa, little tiny people. First people in Japan were Twa, Anu, little tiny people. First people in Egypt were Twa, Anu, Asar, Aset, Heru. They were all Anu, little tiny people. And when they made decisions, everybody had to agree to it. So in Africa, that is generally the way decisions are made. The problem with Africa today is Western systems have come in. The IMF, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and they tell countries what they must do. End your free education. End your free medical care. Sell off your water. I'll be speaking in Jamaica on Garvey's anniversary, the whole nation of Jamaica, August 17th, next month. The IMF has just left Jamaica. The last thing they want to take that the Jamaicans have is their water. You understand? You're a poor person. What if you can't pay because they're going to sell it to some big corporation in the United States or Western Europe? And so what happens if you can't pay for the water? You drink out of a dirty stream. That's what's happened to people in South Africa. So it used to be in Africa, the idea was the land, the air, and the water was owned by no one. It was shared by everyone because it's God's gift. And as a result, you didn't have no people that couldn't afford water because water's free. It's God's gift. And there was nobody homeless because everybody had land they could grow a crop. You understand? But now with this thing called capitalism that a lot of you think is great because some of you are in here to get jobs in the corporations, capitalism is about making the rich rich and the poor poor, baby. I'm telling you. I mean, if you think that this is a great system, then you explain to me why now you can go to college and end up working, making $10, $8.50 an hour. You understand? While the corporations are running away like fat rats. Am I telling the truth? You know what I mean? Huh? I mean, the biggest hustlers on the planet is the pimp called the corporate pimp. So in case you, they don't pay taxes. They hide their money all over the world. I don't either, by the way. I don't pay taxes either, but mine's legal. I have an accounting firm. I am not a tax protester. I just figure if you're exploiting me, I'm not paying you to exploit me. You hear me? But most people are too scared to fight the IRS. I fight the damn IRS, you know what I mean? But it's legal. I ain't claiming nothing I'm not entitled. I just get all my deductions. And I have me a whole firm that represents me. Whole firm. And I pay them money to represent me. Now, if that money was going to health care or education, I'd gladly pay it. You hear what I'm saying? But if it's going to the rich, hell no. But I'm not encouraging you to do that. You only do it if you're smart. You don't want to be no Wesley Snipes going to jail on protesting taxes. And I respect Wesley, black belt in karate, a hell of an actor, and he's conscious. He's done a couple of black films, John Henry Clark and others. I like the brother. But he was listening to those right-wingers. Don't be going up here no tax protest. Get you a firm, brother, and either pay nothing because you're entitled to or pay as little as you have to, but you don't want to be serving no 3 years even though you beat the rap because the judge decided to stick you because you didn't file for taxes. File your taxes and get your refund. You know what I'm talking about? That's a side point. Yeah.
I want to say also NAFTA and the Caribbean Basin are two initiatives that the United States government started in the Caribbean that undermine the indigenous farmers and growers of the Caribbean.
Exactly. Mexico, for example, as a result of NAFTA, In the Mexican Revolution, one of my favorite leaders was a man named Emiliano Zapata. Bad brother, meaning good, you understand? And Zapata fought for the communal rights of the Mexican people. Same traditions that Africans have. The Mexican is a mixture of Spanish, Indian, and African. And the Indian and African cultures are both communal. So they had in the Mexican Constitution the provision that the land could not be sold. And as a result, Mexican farmers could grow their corn or grow whatever they grew and feed themselves. But under NAFTA, the U.S. pressured the corrupt Mexican government to end the communal land rights of Mexican people. And now you had these big corporations going in there and grabbing up the land. And as a result, Mexicans were forced to come into the United States. And now they're calling them aliens when they stole California from the Mexicans. Who's the alien? You know what I mean? Stole Arizona, stole New Mexico. You understand? Stole Texas. Really outright stole Texas, you know? So one of the things that drove the movement was this idea of democracy, that we had our say-so, the people had their say-so. And as a result of that, groups that did this made very few mistakes if your decisions are based on consensus. If Africa was based on African democracy, Africans would be among the most prosperous people on the planet. That's our culture. We wouldn't be selling our resources off. We would be seeing that those resources benefited us. And I'm telling you, in order for Africa to get its act together, it's going to have to go back to, as the hip-hoppers say, black to the future. You know what I mean? Going back to the best of your past and updating it. And so this was a key for us. Go ahead. These were UC Berkeley students getting arrested. We're radicalizing them. This is another point I want to make about African American culture. African American culture is one of only two cultures indigenous to this country. What do you think the other culture is? Native American. Yeah, I got some smart people here. Native American. Some people would think European American because their culture in politics and economics, in military, in science, rules the roost. Law, as illegal as it is, it rules the roost. You know what I mean? But it's not indigenous to this country. It's an import from Europe. American law is based on European common law. American warfare is based on Clausewitz, the idea of using overwhelming force. American economics is based on Adam Smith, a British economist. You understand? The only thing original about Euro-American culture is two things. It's not original, and it's an exaggeration of Europe. Y'all, ain't that funny? You should be laughing. You understand? And 00 Soul, remote control, automatic pilot, Negro, is the first one to say, I ain't got no culture. They took my culture in slavery. There is not a people on the planet that don't have a culture. Culture is your way of life and designed for living. Even dogs have cultures. And different breeds of dogs have different cultures. Y'all know what I'm talking about? But all human beings have culture. It's your way of life. It's your design for living. And in the case of the African in America, the African in America was attacked through enslavement. They tried to wipe out this African culture. But we have the oldest culture on the planet. We came into being 144,000 years ago, and it's an adaptable culture. It's a flexible culture, and it's a culture that's time-tested. So when they outlawed the drum, we made the whole body the drum. When they outlawed African language, we created Ebonics. And every generation of black people got their own way of talking, and you need to really know that language to know what it means. Am I telling the truth? And by the way, y'all hip-hoppers, hip-hop comes from a Wolof expression, which means hippie cat. It's a Wolof term, West Africa. It means seeing from all sides, which also means being hip as opposed to square. Being able to shake your hips and be cool, because that's the rule. Y'all know what I'm talking about? That'd be the African up in there. You be more African than you know. You understand? So they attacked African language, and what we did is
we changed English into something else, because if you listen to the Southern language in the South, the Southern white man is speaking Black Ebonics. Y'all, that's the African vowel system. And towards themselves, they are practicing one of the highest principles of African culture, which is civility. African people are nice people. Some of us ain't nice no more. We know what's happened. Y'all been reading my little book. I ain't romanticizing this stuff, you know what I mean? But we be nice people, basically. Southern whites are nice to each other. They ain't too nice to us. They'll hang us from a low tree or from a high tree. That's a liberal or a conservative. The conservative hangs you high, the liberal hangs you low. Either way, your butt gets hung. But they'll grin and skin. And so they have a level of politeness they learn from us. And that's, again, your African culture. And one of the key things in African culture is the word. The word. And so black folks took this thing, and when they attacked our language, we created the funky word, the blues word, right? Which is a part of the spiritual blues. It's called the blue note. It's at the foundation of the culture. All hip hop is urban blues. It's blues updated. And when we had the spirituals, the African did not think the way the European thought. The European thinks either it's sacred here, Sunday, when you go to pray for God, and it's secular here, which means God ain't no part of it. We saw God in everything. You understand? And so we didn't separate the sacred from the secular. So when we created the spirituals, we created the blues at the same time. Because if you listen to the spirituals, the song says, soon I'll be done with the troubles of this world, going home to live with God. Almost all of that is the blues, baby. Soon I'll be done with the troubles of this world. The end part is God. You understand? And if you listen to gospel, what is gospel but sacred blues? That's Thomas Dorsey, who was a blues singer that put the funkified sound back into gospel. You understand? Because we think in a twin way. The blues are the spiritual. Gospel is sacred blues. You understand? When your head is wrapped on right, then you see things in a balanced way. That's why we're able to skin cats in this country. That's why this movement was so successful. We were operating on the culture and didn't know it. That's a problem with too many of our people today. We're operating on the culture and don't know it. And now that they stuck drugs in our community, we're going crazy because they put another culture in there, and that culture is threatening this rich culture, and we run around talking about we ain't got no culture. You got one of the two cultures indigenous to this country. When you say it's indigenous, it means it's rooted here. You hear me? It means when problems come up, it responds. This is another thing I say about this new African culture. It's organic, meaning when we have problems, the culture responds organically. What was the San Francisco Freedom Movement, or what was the Southern Civil Rights Movement? It was like something in the ground. The people decided, hell no, we ain't taking this mess no more. You understand? It was an organic response. In the 80s, when we had some serious problems, our scholars got together, African-centered scholars. And for the first time in the history of this country, they started an African-centered movement. They went back to ancient Kemet. I'm the only one in this movement of African-centered scholars that comes out of a movement. I knew politically what this meant. Most of them didn't. But they were organically responding to the fact that we didn't know our past. We're a bunch of historical amnesiacs. By the way, US of A, United States of Amnesia. So in case you think we're just talking about black people, the average American knows nothing about their past. And what they do know is jive, not the truth. And we know next to nothing historically because of slavery. And so our scholars came along and said, we're going to go back to black. And they went to Kemet, and they said that is the highest civilization in the ancient world. And they were right. And then what happened is the hip-hoppers picked that up. Public Enemy, KRS-One, a whole bunch of others. They took that on. And so now, you've got people like Chuck D, who stand on principle. And X-Clan, underground, but it's your culture. This corporate stuff ain't your culture. This booty stuff, you know what I mean? The B stuff. All the bling, 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 bling only stuff. That ain't your culture. And there's nothing wrong with you having some wealth, by the way. I'm not into you being poor. We're struggling for black folks to have, everybody is entitled to have their vine and fig tree. You know what I mean? Everybody's got a right to the tree of life. Poverty's misery. So I ain't in here talking to no poverty. You hear me? You need to bust the system that keeps you poor. You hear what I'm talking about? So the point is, this movement came out of this mighty culture. The other thing I want to stress here is this. New African culture is the culture of popular choice in this country. You know that because you know with each generation that comes along with the new spin-off, every other group is following this culture. Am I telling it right? Hip-hop, you got Asian hip-hop, you got Latino hip-hop, you got Native American hip-hop, you got white hip-hop. Am I telling the truth? And we don't take our culture and say, you have to be black. Because another feature of New African culture is we're humanistic people and we're inclusive. We speak, if you listen to the blues or if you listen to hip-hop, good hip-hop, it's speaking to the conditions of humanity, not just black folks. And everybody can relate to it. And then what happens is an Asian, I'm in ethnic studies, San Francisco State, Africana studies, and I hear the Asian hip-hoppers, and they're talking about immigration. They'll take your culture and use it for their own ends, and that's good. Because one of the other features of New African culture is a liberatory culture. It's about freedom. And our definition of freedom is different from the Euro-American definition of freedom. The Euro-American definition of freedom, the one you're sold is freedom, justice, and equality. If that's true, why don't you have any? You understand? If it's all about freedom, justice, and equality, why don't you get any? But I'm going to tell you, Euro-American and European concept of freedom is this. Whoever has the power does what they want to. And I'm a philosopher, by the way, a historian, political theorist. Philosophy is my first subject. And I study African philosophy, Asian philosophy, Native American philosophy, African American philosophy, and European philosophy. And I'll tell you, the founder of European philosophy is a man named Hesiod, H-E-S-I-O-D, H-E-S-I-O-D. He was illiterate. He was a sheep herder and he was a poet. And in his book, Theogony, which is not a book because he obviously couldn't write, but based on what he said, it gets put in a book. He's really speaking to what the Greeks thought. And he talks about heaven, and he says, in heaven, there's this God, and the supreme God for the Greeks was Zeus, Z-E-U-S. A lot of you will go through Greek philosophy and not understand what you study, because I went through it and didn't understand what I was studying. When I went to San Francisco State, the professor laid on the desk and said, what I'm telling you today, you won't understand any more of this by the end of the semester, and I dropped the class. I said, yeah, if I can't understand you, I'm dropping you. You know what I mean? But the thing is, Hesiod said this, of Zeus, the supreme God. Zeus did what he wanted to do. In other words, the definition of freedom comes from their idea of their religion of arbitrary power. That if you have the power, you do what you want to do. And if you don't believe it, check out the economic meltdown that occurred in 2008. And notice that they brought the global economy down, and then they came to you and told you to save them. But the people they brought down who lost their homes, how many of them got saved? Obama had $30 billion to save people on foreclosure, and he said, we just forgot to spend it. Do you believe that? No, because presidents are serving the rich. They save the rich. They're not saving your poor boy. In fact, when you voted for him for a second term, your unemployment rate was the same as it was in the first term. Everybody else's went down except yours. A double old soul, got a brother in the White House. And, it's nice to have a brother in the White House, but I'm telling you, I don't care if you're black, brown, red, white, yellow. If you're wrong, you're wrong. And everybody else put their foot up his butt but us. And everybody got something. Latinos did on immigration. Gays did on their issues. Everybody, labor did, everybody got something except remote control, double old soul Negro. Because he's so glad to have a black president. Guess what? He was smart enough to know that. You understand? And I ain't putting him down. I'm not putting him up. But I'm saying your culture says right comes before anything else. So the European conception of freedom is whoever has the power does what they want. The new African, I'm not talking about the whole culture, I'm just giving you some little tippy points, little tip off the top. You have a different conception of freedom. And by the way, next to spirit and family, freedom is next to those two things the most important thing in new African culture. And because of the way we faced oppression, we reformulated this idea of freedom. We came up with one of the most complex, beautiful ideas of freedom on the planet. Because black people love freedom. I'll tell you something about black people. We don't like anybody over us telling us what to do. Is that the truth?
Yes, sir.
Let me tell you something else. If you are a brother and you're in a relationship, the easiest way to lose the relationship is try to tell your woman what to do. That ain't smart. Am I telling you the truth? And I would say to the sisters, because many of you come out of strong families, and for the last 2 generations, most of you ain't seen a man in the house, so you all are used to having strong women in the house, but you better understand if you want to keep a man, don't be telling him what to do either, because we don't like it. Am I telling the truth? Ladies will say, I wonder why he won't do it, because you told him. Suggested, baby. Offer alternatives. Give choices. Because we have a different conception of freedom. And here's our definition of freedom. Listen to this. And it's in hip hop. It's in the civil rights movement. It's in Black Power. It was in Malcolm. It was in the Black Panther Party. I don't care what. It's in jazz. And by the way, it's really in jazz, the highest complex music on the planet. We have this idea, whereas arbitrary freedom is the idea whoever has the power does whatever they want. Think about that. That's savage. Because that means you can do anything. And by the way, they did. They wiped out the Native Americans on this continent here. They went across the planet wiping out people of color in the name of progress. The slogan of the average white person was, the only good Indian's a dead Indian. I had Native Americans who said it was illegal to be Native American until recently. I mean, they're trying to kill us until recently. You hear me? But the African conception of freedom, and I'm quoting Dizzy Gillespie. How many people heard of Dizzy Gillespie? One of our great jazz musicians. He was a trumpet player. He was an innovator of bebop, one of the most complex musical forms created in the 20th century. And he was a deep thinker. His book, To Be or Not to Bop, is on philosophy. You hear me? And Dizzy said this, African-American conception of freedom is contradictory. And that's, by the way, the nature of our culture. It's complex. We have the most complex culture in this country because we're dealing in a complex reality. This is not a simple reality. And so he said this, the African-American idea of freedom is based on 2 contradictory principles, discipline and freedom. Discipline and freedom. Now think about this. Most people would think that it's one or the other. You have discipline or you have freedom. But actually, freedom is discipline. You really aren't free. Freedom isn't free. There's a price for freedom. Frederick Douglass said the price of freedom was struggle. And if you're going to be effective, like this San Francisco Civil Rights, we didn't lose a battle. Discipline, baby. Muhammad Ali, best boxer that ever hit the ring, or maybe Jack Johnson, you have to debate it, but they had discipline, you understand? And when you have discipline, then you can be free. Muhammad Ali could do rope-a-dope because he had the discipline to break the rules of boxing. The rules of boxing is don't do rope-a-dope. Don't get on the ropes, you'll get whipped. But if you're the master, you can create new rules. And so the key thing about discipline and freedom is this. In our culture, you don't have the freedom to do wrong. Y'all get this? That's the first level of discipline. If you're a musician, you can't play that instrument wrong. Now you can come up with new ways to play it after you have the discipline to come up with a new school of music. But until you master the fundamentals, you gotta do it right. But right ethics is always the first thing. And then you're free, and that's called improvisation. Or you all call it freestyling. It's based on discipline and freedom. And then Dizzy said this, It's also based on two other contradictory principles: spontaneous organization. The entire civil rights movement, Black Power movement, Black Panther movement, Marcus Garvey movement, the slave revolts that occurred in this country, the way my great-grandmother, who would go into her shelf to come up with some food when there wasn't anything to cook, she would put something in a pot, and when they got through, she called it slop, and you wouldn't want to eat it. And then she called it gullion, and you'd say, it's got to be good. You know what I mean? And out of literally nothing, she created something, and it was spontaneous organization. It's creating something on the spot. Good jazz musician like Miles Davis would go into a studio with 2 or 3 notes and come up with a whole record album. And he would say this, because he nearly lost his voice. He'd say, great music starts with what you know, and then you go beyond yourself. Now imagine, without anything laid down, he would come up with Kind of Blue, one of the prettiest pieces of music you ever heard. You understand? On the spur of the moment, Rosa Parks said, I ain't giving this seat up. Edie Nixon said, I'm going to test this in court. Edie Nixon calls Martin Luther King and says, I want to have a meeting in your church. He said, I got to think about it. Edie Nixon called all the preachers and said, the meeting's in King's church. And then on the spur of the moment, and by the way, 2 weeks earlier, Rosa Parks had been in a meeting at the Highlander Training School. It was a leadership training school in the South. And she said, black people in Montgomery will never get together because, you know, it's just hard to get black people to unite. And then on the spur of the moment, this is a slave narrative where enslaved Africans said, we would think of a sound of Africa and we would create a music on the spur of the moment. That's spontaneous organization. We are a spontaneously organized people. And we take it on the spot and it comes out organized because there's discipline behind it. And I'm going to say this about New African culture and the African American, and all people have their own culture. Chinese, by the way, study Chinese culture. The ethos of the Chinese people is Li, L-I, comes from Confucius. Li means order. You got 1,300,000,000 Chinese, you better have some order. Handful of Chinese leaders in China are respected enough that they've shifted their economy to the point where 300 million people have been taken out of poverty. They still got 1 billion that they've got to take out, but they've taken 300 million out while more and more people in this country are getting poor. You hear me? So they had this idea of Li. That's their thing. The New African has an ethos. Ethos, my wife is very heavy. We were sitting on the porch before we married, and she made the comment. She said, the African in America has an ethos distinct from all Africans in the world. She was born in Britain. She comes from Barbados. She was educated in high school and some college in New York, and then went back to Britain where I met her. By the way, this is my reward. I was speaking on the 50th anniversary of the 5th Pan-African Congress, which was the greatest meeting of Africans in the 20th century. I chaired the political committee to the 6th Pan-African Congress in Tanzania, 1973. The last person's house I stayed in was this lady here. See, God will reward you if you do good work. You know, that's a side point. So the point is that in New African culture, this idea of freedom is fundamental to the culture. And we have a very creative conception. So we have our own ethos. Chinese is Li. The European is, if he got the power, he does what he wants to. He dresses it up and makes it look nice, but it's real savage, baby. You hear me? You better have some power because the only thing they respect is power. Am I telling you the truth? Am I telling you? And some of us are starting to act like him, and that's no good. That's no good. Some of us are starting to act in an arbitrary way. That drug culture has seeped in on some of us. You know what I mean? So my wife was saying that our ethos is distinct from all other ethos of Africans in the world. I never thought about that. I said, wow, that's heavy. So I started to think, What is our ethos? Ethos is your way of life. It's the way you carry yourself, the way you walk, the way you talk, the way you think, the way you see the world, you know? She wasn't putting us down. She was saying ours is different. You know what I mean? It's unique. So I started looking at it, and I said, well, you know what? The ethos of the African in America, all ethos really reflect what people need. Every culture, their ethos speaks to their needs. The Chinese need order. You couldn't have consensus-based democracy in China. I know the West is pushing for them to get their democracy. They ain't got any here. It's hypocrisy hidden as democracy. You know what I mean? So if you check us out, our ethos is what we need to survive. Guess what it is? Can anybody guess what the ethos of the African in America is? Anybody got any ideas? Huh?
Unity.
Well, when we get it, yeah, that's important. But even to get it.
Self.
Huh?
Self.
Self. You have to be strong persons and at the same time be a part of a group. You need both. Anybody else? Well, some of us are becoming like that. Yeah, some of us are becoming like that, but no, that's not our ethos. Anybody got any ideas? Yeah. It's knowledge is a key to it. Anybody else? Yeah. Respect is key. All people need that. Love is key. Huh? Equality, important. Yeah.
Your demeanor.
Demeanor?
Your demeanor.
Yes, but the question is, what is the demeanor? Because that's your ethos. Anybody else got any ideas?
Yes.
The ethos, huh? Spirit is key to it. And in fact, it's what drives it. That's important. Yeah.
Character.
Huh?
Your character.
Character is very important. Yeah. Culture is what you're drawing from. The ethos of the African in America is creativity. The African in the United States is the most creative African on the planet, maybe the most creative group on the planet. I can't say that for sure, but definitely in this society, our survival has depended on our creativity. The way we reconstructed culture in this country was an act of supreme creativity, not because we're more creative by nature. We had to be. Because the attack on African culture here was more thorough than the Caribbean, because in the Caribbean you were a majority on the land. Majority on the land in South America. So you could maintain a culture that was more purely African. You had to really work it to recreate an African culture here. You had to take the guiding principles of the culture and rework it into this environment, and sometimes disguise it to the point that some of us don't even realize what it's based on. Because we'll run around saying we don't want to have anything to do with Africa, and yet this culture is one of the most original among Africans. It is the most original African culture on the planet, and Africans will tell you that. The most innovative Africans are here, not because we're superior, but because it's necessary for our survival. Just as the Chinese need order for their survival, we need creativity for ours. Am I telling the truth? Yeah. Look at Jay-Z. My wife was telling me, you know, this boy only gives up 15% to the corporation. Say whatever you want to about him, you know what I mean? Jay-Z ain't selling out his stuff to the corporations. You can say what you want about everything else. You know more about him than I do. But the fact is, he was creative enough to play their game and beat them at it.
That's right.
You know what I mean? He said, not only do I want my originals, you're only getting 15% for distributing it all over the world. I want the rest of my money. And I bet you know he counts every penny of it. Because coming from the streets, you know, you learn a few things about business. Hit the rest of this. It'll be over in a minute. So again, Sheraton Palace. Go ahead, hit the next one.
Professor Sharp, what about repatriation and reparations?
Got any more? Any more coming up? Reparations is the right of people to be recompensed for their past oppression. We're entitled to it. The thing is, only powerful people get reparations. This was the arrest in the Sheraton Palace. And this, by the way, is Dick Gregory. How many people have heard of Dick Gregory? This man gave up millions of dollars for the movement, you know, really good brother. Hit the next one. So, you know, we're entitled to reparations, but you have to have power to get that, you know. This was the victory at the Sheraton Palace Hotel. Go on. This was the campaign against Auto Row for jobs. Over 10,000 people out to fight for jobs there. Hit it again.
Auto pickets go wild.
Yeah. And this shows you the number of people on Auto Row. Thousands. Hit it again. Again, Auto Row. And this is where we defeat the car companies to see that blacks can, you know, you driving Cadillacs and can't sell any. You know what I mean? Of course, now black people have advanced beyond Cadillacs. Go ahead. And this is, again, the victory. Go ahead. And then the biggest campaign for jobs in the civil rights movement was the Bank of America. I led that campaign. Biggest bank in the world. Hired no blacks, no brown, no red, no yellow. And we shouldn't have been able to beat them. They had more power than we had. And the only place they had the Bank of America was the state of California, because at that time, banks could not operate out of more than one state. The Bank of America had been the Bank of Italy before. They changed it to Bank of America, America's Vespucci, you know, origin of America, Italian. So we took them on. I won't go into the details, but I say we had a very sophisticated strategy. It took 6 months, and we beat them. Go ahead. And this was in 13 cities throughout California. And this was the day and night branch of the Bank of America. Go ahead. This is the final victory in the San Francisco Civil Rights Movement. In 1965, Lyndon Johnson, how many people heard of Lyndon Johnson? He came up with the War on Poverty program. It's supposed to eliminate poverty. But he ended up in the war in Vietnam, and it ended up putting most of the federal budget into killing Vietnamese, and the Vietnamese ended up winning. But he came up with the War on Poverty program, and it was clear that if we didn't take this program over, it would end up taking us over, because it was going to end up hiring organizers. So I decided that if the War on Poverty program was going to be organized, we would take it. And so as a result, first time in the history of the state of California, I formed a coalition with the Chinese American community. There's a guy named J.K. Choi who was a multimillionaire. He owned a bank. And because our movement's the leading movement, he would send me newspaper clippings on the movement. Every month I go to Chinatown, get free Chinese food, and talk to members of the Chinese American community. Very smart man. He'd been a general in Chiang Kai-shek's army. And so I decided to form a group called Citizens United Against Poverty. And I made myself chair. This first rule in a coalition is you lead it. So I called up J.K. Choi, and I said, J.K., I'm forming a group made up of the poor in San Francisco, and I'm giving you 25%, which means when we take over the War on Poverty program, Chinatown will control what they do with 25% of millions of dollars. We have no say-so over it. You in? I'm in. Then I was raised in the near the Mission in San Francisco, the Bernal Heights, and I went to junior high school in the Mission, and I knew the Mexican American community. So I called up a guy named Gallegos, who was a leader in the Mexican American community. I said the same thing. I'm forming Citizens United Against Poverty, and the Mexicans and the Latinos will get 25%. When we take this over, you're in charge of what you do with this money. We're talking about millions of dollars. And then I didn't call anybody up in the Fillmore and the Hunters Point. I had the Fillmore and the Hunters Point, and I had 50%. That's the rule. You form a coalition, you run it. Now, this is, I'm going to give you a little clue on strategy here, and then we can talk. The art of war, most people think, is bloody. But the art of war is to win a war without a fight. That's Sun Tzu, Chinese. He wrote a book called The Art of War. The art of war is to win a war without a fight. You'd say, how do you do that? This is a key thing, Sun Tzu. If you don't know yourself, you'll lose half the time, and you know the enemy. If you know the enemy and don't know yourself, you'll lose half the time. To win and be victorious all the time, you need to know yourself and know the enemy. Even then, you could lose. Don't think because you know the enemy and know yourself, you're guaranteed a victory. No, you're not. When I was then 24, I ran this. This is a perfect strategy. I used to think the Bank of America was our greatest achievement. I later realized it was the War on Poverty program because we won it without a fight. When I was young, I knew how to do it, but I couldn't explain how to do it. Now at my age, I can explain how to do it. So I've run perfect strategies where I could sit down and watch my enemy fall and know exactly when he was going to. That's really nice. Y'all know that? You don't even touch him, and he falls. So here's the rule. Johnson had this policy, said the poor should control the poverty program. So that's why I got the poor together, so they could control it. I couldn't explain it then. I could explain it now. What it was is, when you win a war without fighting, it's because your policy matches the policy of your enemy. And when it matches the policy of your enemy, he falls. You understand? So when I had the Mexicans, the Latinos, the Chinese, and the blacks, I walked into the mayor's office, hit the next one. This is when we gained control of the War on Poverty program. It says right here, Mayor John F. Shelley yesterday consented to put the poor in charge of the San Francisco proposed $3.1 million anti-poverty program. $3.1 million then would be worth about a couple of $100 million now. You could buy a Victorian for $20,000 then. And now you can't get one for less than $2 million. You understand? So it goes on to talk about how he turned it over, and I'm leading this thing. So what happens is, this guy here was in charge. His name's Arthur Coleman. He had a law degree and he was a medical doctor. He was in charge of the poverty program, was a mayor running it. So when I came in, I said, we have the poor, turn it over to us. He turned it over to us. And as a result, for about 3 years, we put millions of dollars in the Fillmore, the Hunters Point, Chinatown, and the Mexican community. And we organized 45,000 black people block by block. And then I went to the redevelopment agency and told them I wanted a 4-square block area of San Francisco, and I had money. They said, how much you have? $1. Got a 4-square block area on Edie and Ellis in San Francisco that now is probably worth $700 or $800 million for $1. And I went to the Senate and lobbied for low-income housing, and we got it passed. And we built 211 cooperative units in the Fillmore called Marcus Garvey, Martin Luther King. Now, I didn't have a place to stay. I stayed at my father's, stayed at my girlfriend. I didn't have a roof over my head. My rule is I don't profit from any movement I lead. The people have that. And today, if you got that housing, back in the 60s, you got a 1,400 square foot apartment building. It's a co-op. The people own it. You're paying $170 a month. You hear what I'm saying? Huh? Now. And again, how were we able to do that? I became a Garveyite. And I adopted some of the philosophies of the Honorable Marcus Garvey. How many people have heard of Garvey? Garvey believed in economic self-reliance. And so later on, after CORE, we formed a group called Pan-African People's Organization that still operates. We got a bunch of businesses to finance us. And so this was part of that. Because in the civil rights movement, we knew how to demonstrate, to march, to do that kind of stuff. But we didn't know how to build businesses, how to build institutions. From Garvey, we learned that. Just as the Nation of Islam learned how to build institutions through Garvey. Because Honorable Elijah Muhammad had been a corporal in the Garvey movement. Malcolm X's mother and father were both leaders in the Garvey movement. The Honorable Marcus Garvey is the greatest organizer produced in the Western Hemisphere in the 20th century. Organized millions of Africans all over the Western Hemisphere. A little old black man that said, up, you mighty race, you can accomplish what you will. So that's kind of background. I had some other things I was going to do, but this was improvised here. Y'all get this. So I'm open for questions.
You mentioned reparation, but you mentioned reparation, repatriation.
to Africa.
Right. Or to a area where we can be thrown out. You know, the Nation of Islam is advocating for certain states in the United States to be divided off, and they control certain states. So, but one way or the other, separating and building our own economic or our own culture.
Got some heavy people in here. I used to be a Garveyite strict, meaning as a part of the civil rights movement, I had an awakening. And this, by the way, is something that I really want to stress. The most important gain of the civil rights, Black Power, Black Panther, Pan-Africanist movements was the reconstruction of the black mind. That was the biggest gain, not the jobs. It was the reconstruction of the black mind. And I just want to briefly say this, and I'll get to your point. In the midst of this movement, I was having lunch at a restaurant called Virginia's Restaurant. The black community supported us. They fed us 2 meals a day for 5 years. And I had a friend, Norman Brown. He's still my good friend. Yeah, you know him. Yeah, good brother. And I'm in my second year of law school, graduated San Francisco State, government major. And I'm taking on the biggest corporations in the world. And Norman Brown gave me my first education in political science. He told me how the system worked. Norman came from a town called Eatonville, which is where Zora Neale Hurston came from, all-black town. It was the first all-black town organized by black people in the United States. Norman had never seen a white person until he came to New York. He was a little guy, about 2 years older than me, driving a cab at that time. And so Norman's explaining to me how the system works. I'm a government major, and I didn't know how the system worked. I believed it was a democracy. You see, I had bought that stuff. And Norman showed me the corporations are running things, you know what I mean? Big business controls government. And I'm saying to him, I said, I know, one of my favorite words. But to myself, I'm saying, oh shit. Because 4 years of college, 2 years of law school, wasted. I had bought into, because I was politically assimilated. Because in this chapter on the integration trap, we talk about cycles of consciousness and the need for the reconstruction of the black mind. I'm making the point that a lot of groups in the movement did not reconstruct the black mind. The Panthers had a problem with reconstructing the black mind. A lot of little gangsters that came to the Panthers, they didn't know how to de-gangsterize it. And you better be able to reconstruct the black mind now, because you got some people running around here now that really think they're gangsters. That's right. Young people call me an OG, and I understand it's a compliment. I say, thank you, brother, but I'm not an OG. I'm an OR. What's that? I'm an original revolutionary. I kicked the CIA's behind, FBI's behind, corporate behind. You hear me? Nothing original about being a gangster. And gangsterism don't come out of African culture. We didn't have no pimps in Africa, no drug dealers in Africa, no prostitutes in Africa, because women were respected. You understand? So I know, you all think this is cool. Ain't nothing cool about it. You can't steal your freedom. You got to take it, and that's a battle.
Yes, sir.
Hustler, Superfly ain't going to get you no freedom. Superfly was what began to take us off. You know what I mean? So what happened is, when Norman Brown explained how the system worked, I began to have my first free thoughts. And this is a key point I'm making in this book, The Integration Trap, is that if you're going to be free, you have to free your mind. And to free your mind, you have to see the world through your eyes, not through somebody else's. And so what Norman did in explaining how the system worked, it got me to think of my first free thoughts. Now, my father had been telling me this, but his consciousness was ahead of mine. I didn't get it. When they were going to draft him to World War II, and I was in the Marine Reserves at this point, my father would have never joined no Marine Reserves. You know what I mean? I was a machine gunner. Baddest one in my unit, too. My father, when they were going to draft him, they took him before the draft board. My father said he was a little short, brother. He was light complexion. A lot of people would think he was white, but he had black features, and he was proud of being black. And we went before that draft board. He said, draft me. I ain't killing no Germans. They look like you, but they ain't got no southern accent. They ain't lynched my men or raped my women. Draft me. I ain't killing no Japanese. They look like my people. Draft me. and give me an M1 or a machine gun, I'm going to shoot every redneck cracker I can blow away. You hear me? And they gave him a 4F, which meant that he was disqualified for the draft, which meant that he was qualified to continue to be our father and continue to fight white supremacy. And he never told my mother this because that was how bad he was as a black man. He told us, didn't tell my mother. And my mother only found out after he died.
A couple of my students were asking in their questions about today. You mentioned that communities are more fragmented, and there's been this black flight. Would that be a further obstacle in terms of creating some of the coalitions that you were able to create 50 years ago?
I want to finish my point, and then I'll come to
okay.
it. Okay. I'm making a point. The point is this, that in reconstructing the black mind, freeing your mind, thinking for yourself is crucial. And so what happened to Malcolm X went through this same freedom of the black mind in prison. He discovered that he had an enemy, and he began to do his homework. And so the scholar I am today is based on me realizing that I had been miseducated through European education and hitting the right books on African history, on African and African American culture, and on European history to know my enemy. The other point I want to make is this. I was given the example of Garvey. Garvey became my first master. And so I picked up on Garveyism as a result of that. And the point I was making in the integration trap is when you're freeing the mind, there are two things that happen. One is you get your identity straight and begin to know yourself and begin to love yourself. The other thing is you get your destiny straight, which means we all have gifts, and so you discover your gifts. Malcolm discovered his gift was as an organizer and a public speaker. Hold it, Pam. And so apprenticeship is key to African American culture. And your question about Garvey, your question about should we get land in Africa or land in the South? When I apprenticed under Garvey, I thought we'd all leave this country, go back to Africa. Then I went to Africa in 1973, and I realized that the African reality and ours are similar but different. And I realized that what we had to do was Africanize our reality here. So I don't think it's possible to cede separate states because there was a civil war fought by whites over separate states. And they'll fight you as hard for one state as for the whole country. The question is going to be changing the system. And changing the system and Africanizing it, Asianizing it, Latinoizing it, so that it's just, taking a crooked system and making it just. So that's my answer on that. You don't have to agree. And I think we have the right to go to Africa. So those of us that want to can, but most of us aren't going to leave. And most of us wouldn't do Africa any good right now. Some of us could, with skills. Okay. Now, your question about the flight from the black community, that was one of the questions.
A couple of the students asked that question.
Yeah. In the book, there's reference to the fact that the black middle class, too much of the black middle class has deserted the black community. They benefited from the movement, and then at the same time turned their back on their own people. Too many. And too many now don't care about average, everyday black folks. And this is a real challenge for you because if you get a degree, professional degree, the question is, what are you going to do with that? Are you going to use that degree to help your people? And this is not just for black people, this is true for all groups. What are you going to do with it? So the point about black flight is the black middle class owes its prosperity to everyday black people and middle class black people who fought for what they have. And they have to pay back. I'm going to Jamaica. And the problem in Jamaica is the black middle class doesn't care about the masses of its people. And too many of them are divided on color and other elite considerations. So that's part of it. Another question?
Do any of my students want to ask a question themselves directly? Gregory? Yeah, you said you had a question. Gregory.
How you doing, sir?
Yeah.
just following the same thing when you're talking about the reparations. I kind of let that go a while ago because I figured if it was wrote down on paper somewhere and they're not following that, then I'm okay with that. My biggest issue with it, because I see it on the news constantly, how they go after not-just war criminals and they constantly finding people and taking money from people as far as what crimes they committed to against other people. Like, I feel like the Native Americans get paid, you know, for what happened to them. I believe at one point in time the jail people get paid, fair weather management right there. And as far as us not ever getting anything, where do we start with that at the top or the bottom? Because it's like, why aren't they going after the Jim Crow era type of thing? As far as, like, even after when they abolished the slavery, so-called, or whatever, and they made the white picket fence laws and everything, how they kept that going for years and years until war still being able to enslave black people. Why is there no nothing to that? Even if we look at the cotton industry, you know, all that money was somewhere.
Yeah,
all that
right.
free labor, like we can't get a dime behind that, because I'm sure that money came from somewhere and is paid something that's still going right now.
Native Americans have never received reparations. Native Americans just received extermination and reservation camps, concentration camps. Japanese Americans did get $25,000 per person, but it was for those that were still alive. And so many of them died before they got it. And it was nothing. I mean, because they lost their land, they lost their homes and whatnot. So it was really cheap. It was on the cheap. But it was better than nothing. There's been a reparations movement in this country for a number of years. I think you're probably familiar with it. And there have been a number of moves to address the issue of reparation. And there have been many different forms in which people have proposed reparations take place, not just in terms of money. Some of them have proposed institutional development, business development, various forms of development. So we're entitled to reparations. I'm simply saying we need the power to achieve it, and we need to be clear about what we're going to do with it when we get it. Because it's got to help build the group, not just go into each person's pocket. That might go right back to the economy. But we're entitled to it. I hear that. I hear that.
I'm saying if you can go find people from World War II that took somebody's painting off their wall and trace them down and demand that they get their painting back and their money, or and you did that to them and you prosecute them for that years and years later, why you can't find nobody from the 50s?
No, you're right. We just need the power to enforce it. The reason the Jews got reparations from Germany is Germany lost World War II and the American government forced them to. Need power for it.
Hi, my name is Victoria. As of now, I am the vice president of the Black Student Union at Berkeley City College. Basically, I want to ask for some of your advice. I've been having a very hard time mobilizing my peers into action. One thing I don't want to do is take a sort of like fruit and basket approach to our culture. That's done all the time. You know, our culture is individualized, you know, constantly. One issue I want to bring attention to is the fact that UCC has eliminated Black Studies from their campus.
That's the college you're going to?
I take classes there.
ACC. What's ACC?
No, BCC, Berkeley City
Okay.
College. It's
All
part
right.
of the corruption system. I'm open to any advice, any kind of knowledge or game I can get. I've been asking a lot of my leaders, a lot of my elders, and I'm getting some really good feedback. You know,
You're in the BSU?
BSU.
What's your position?
I'm the vice president.
Black student organizations are really important organizations, whatever their name is, Pan-African Student Union, Black Student Union. One of the things is with BSUs is that you have a turnover problem. You'll have a situation where sometimes you'll have good leadership, they will come in and really fire things up, and then when they graduate, the next group may not be able to be as strong as that group. So I think one of the things that's needed for BSUs is leadership training that can systematically train students in the art of leadership and the art of organizing, how to pull groups together, how to manage groups, how to raise issues, and how to fight for things that are in the interest of your students. I've created a program called Per-Ankh Amilcar Cabral Leadership Academy, and it's based on this apprenticeship system that African people have developed. And I'd be willing to work with you on it. But what you need is a program that systematically trains leadership. So when one group leads, you're preparing the next group to take their place. And then within it, the art of organizing, the art of leadership to fight for what you want on campus, including getting back black studies. You know?
It's heartbreaking.
What's the percentage of black students on that campus?
17%.
17?
17%. Of course, their staff does not reflect that.
That's higher than the percentage at San Francisco State, which is much smaller. Numbers doesn't really determine your power. It's how well organized you are. You know? So I'd be willing to work with you to get my number and stuff before I leave. Give me my card. Anybody else? Yeah.
Just to say, that's my home school too, and I would be willing to, I go to UCC, I take all my classes there. I would be willing to give it to you and talk to you. Because I was been saying, I'm in the chess club and we got more members than y'all. And more power.
Is there anybody here from the Laney BSU?
But my question is,
Right here. Yeah.
I am not well versed enough to speak on it, but I am entering into the black BSU here at Laney College.
Is there a BSU on campus?
Yes.
Anybody here a part of it? Other questions? Hold it. There was a real good question and you read to me over the phone.
Oh,
Okay,
yes.
you got it?
That would be, no, sir. The one about, sorry about that.
Do you know who
I
it
know,
was?
I know whose question it was. I don't know if you have it with you or in front of you. Irenisha, did you remember any of your questions from yesterday? There was one about not having a culture or feeling like not have. I just gotta find that now.
Right here. Here's why he's looking for it. Yeah.
Okay, so during your presentation, you talked about how the Birmingham and using children and elementary school students and middle school students and they were like hosed by water. Isn't that a form of exploitation in a way? I don't know. I found that that's kind of in a way some sort of exploitation of children.
You thought the children were being exploited because they were being used in the demonstration?
Yeah, like I understand what you're trying to do and the intentions, but still using children in a way is kind of, I don't want to say it's morally wrong, but in a way, isn't it a little bit, I guess, controversial in a way, using children? Because children, even though you pointed out that they were fearless, they're only fearless because of what they don't know, or they don't know what they're getting into in a way. Like from a parent's perspective, I'm guessing that parents don't want their children to be in some sort of danger, and I guess getting hosed by some water is, yeah, something I don't think a lot of people.
Okay, his question is, wasn't it exploiting children for them to be involved in the movement being hit by water hoses and having dogs suck on them? First of all, the children wanted to do it and they were able to make the decision. That's number one. Number two, all over the world, children play a leading role in movements for social change. And some of them may not be elementary, junior high, and high school students, and especially high school students lead armed struggles all over the world, in China, in Vietnam, in Africa. And they're not child soldiers. They're people fighting for freedom. And that's because usually liberation movements are heavily made up of the young, because the young have a sense of fearlessness and a sense of the future. King was criticized for this, but it worked. And these youth were proud of what they did. And I'll bet you if you asked most of them today, they would say the most important thing they did in their life was to be involved in that movement. You know?
I just want to comment, in South Africa during the Apartheid movement, it was the children who actually started the boycotts and led the first boycotts in South Africa. They didn't have to worry about losing their jobs or losing their homes because they didn't own homes, they didn't have jobs, they didn't have nothing to lose like their parents had things to lose. If their boss say, hey, you was part of this protest, and that's what usually happens, you're part of this protest, I want to fire you, or you're part of this protest, you can't live here anymore. So the children had that freedom to be out there and not be able to be subjected to that.
Go ahead, you got that question?
Yeah, and I just got another one too. This is, what if some youth in impoverished communities have never heard of or have been a part of the African culture? Is it then still a choice? As a young person who has lived in ghettos all over the Bay Area, including places like Hunters Point, East Oakland, and Richmond, I have witnessed parents raising their children without ever introducing them to an African culture. Generations of this era are not being taught different at home or in school. Therefore, I have a hard time understanding how the writer came to the conclusion that people in the ghetto have a choice. I believe the elders need to stop blaming the youth and implement strategic plans into the community in order to bring awareness to the African culture.
Yeah, I thought that was a real profound comment, real profound.